everyone. Welcome to Guy Aitchison's Reinventing the Tattoo Community. We're so glad to have you here. If you haven't already, you can find the mobile app on the Apple Store or Google Play that allows stuff like zooming into some of these events, and it's a really good place to find all of the listed events, and you can join all of these wonderful groups and community stuff going on. And today you're going to be joining us for As Above, So Below, the Alchemy of Indirect Oil Painting, Part 1. We're starting an underpainting. This is an epic painting seminar with David Heskin. I'm sure everybody's been seeing the posts about it, and it's beautiful, beautiful stuff. So very exciting. Before we get started, I wanted to say thank you for our awesome sponsors, since they make it possible for us to give this content to you for free. We've got inkjet stencils, and if you go onto the app and you find their page, you can find information about getting free stencil samples sent directly to your studio. Very exciting. Before you would end up buying any of their inkjet stencil machines, you can check it out for yourself. We've also got Jesse Smith's Loose Screw Tattoo, which I believe they are still looking for a resident artist. And that has some really, really cool perks, so it's worth looking into. And if you mention that you heard about it from us, then he'll know that you've got some like-minded stuff going on. Then we've got our newest sponsor is Raw Pigments, and they are making beautiful inks with raw vegan ingredients. You can check out their Instagram, and you can check out them on the app as well. And we've got Cheyenne Tattoo Equipment. So before we get started fully, I'm going to share my screen so you guys can check out the exciting event that we're going to be having on next Saturday. So here we go. If everybody hasn't already seen the posts about it, we are going to be doing the Equinox Festival. And it is going to be epic. Let me just get that playing for you here. It's giving me some grief. I apologize. There seems to be a little bit of technical difficulties. Let me just rewind that. See if it gets going here. All right. So in case that wasn't clear, because there was a little bit of a hiccup there, that's March 20th at 8 p.m. and that is going to be hosted by Guy Aitchison. It's going to be music by Aja Lu and very psychedelic, trippy visuals by Android Jones. And there's going to be some live paint jams, so you can come and zoom into a paint jam area and paint and chat while you're also listening to the music, or you can just sit back and have a projector going and watch some cool visuals while you listen to awesome music. So either way, it should be a lot of fun. And I'm just going to, I think, pass it over to David if you're ready to join us. I know Guy will probably come on and give a little bit more of an introduction, but we can get a little started here.
Good.
Awesome.
You ready for me?
I'm ready for you.
All right. Well, I just want to express my gratitude for being able to drop into Reinventing the Tattoo and to share a lot of the painting techniques, or at least a little slice of the painting techniques that I've been learning and developing and practicing for the last 25 years. I started oil painting at 15 and felt really fortunate to have kind of jumped in very early. It was sort of my first artistic love, and tattooing came a few years later at about the age of 18, where I had an apprenticeship with Megan Hoagland in Minnesota, and eventually tattooed in Seattle for about 5 years before oil painting pulled me back in. So I've taken about an 18-year break from tattooing, but just now I'm jumping back into the field, and there's kind of no better way to do so than to bring what I've learned and what I've been doing in painting back to the tattoo community. So it's a real pleasure to be here and sharing some of these ideas, and it's sort of just a primer in a way. This is the alchemy of indirect oil painting, and there's a few things I'll speak to about that. But first, I want to just say this is not expected to be a completion-based course. I tend to paint rather slow, particularly when we're talking about layered painting. So there's no way I would expect anyone to finish anything during this period. Hey, there's Guy jumping in.
David, hey, I'm just getting oriented.
Nice to see you, Guy.
Hey, all right. And we've got Kaya here with us. She's going to be joining us in today's class. And we've got 3 panels each set aside for today. But I wanted to hear what you had to say about this, because I've been promising everyone that this is techniques that I wouldn't be teaching them. And so I'd love to hear it in your words.
Well, let me just start with the title of the course in a way. As above, so below has a lot in it. And how I relate to that is we're taking this inspiration, this higher level of inspiration and making it manifest. So we're really looking at how do we take our vision and apply it in perhaps a different way than some of us have before. And I really appreciated when I was tattooing eons ago, and now I'm coming back to it, but that you, Guy, always were saying, find another medium to work in. Find some other medium you can experiment with that's not tattoo. There's such a pressure to perfect the tattoo. You don't have a lot of room to experiment on skin. It can really, it could really throw your life off if you have a failed experiment on skin. But in painting, it's really, we have all these options to be able to try something. And I don't really think that you can fail if it's an experiment. You always learn from an experiment. So that's why we have a few different panels to work on today, a few different surfaces. Beyond that, like, why alchemy? It's sort of like, what's with this idea? And for me, there's this idea of turning lead into gold, sure. And we'll get into that with pigments. Certainly there's a correlate there, but what is the arrangement? How does the arrangement of pigment on canvas or on a panel become exponentially more valuable than the pigments in the canvas itself? Like, why is a Rembrandt or a Da Vinci so culturally valuable as compared to those pigments? And, it's sort of answering a question with a question, but somewhere in there lies what we're doing alchemically with paint. We're really turning these gross base materials into something that lifts up humanity or has the potential to bring us to a new dimension. So the third part of the title of the course to kind of define is indirect oil painting. That may or may not be a term that people have familiarized with, but sort of in contrast to the alla prima painting that's been going on recently. These gorgeous still lifes with Nick Baxter and with yourself, Guy. Like, this is sort of I would say the scenic route to painting, where that's direct painting, alla prima. You're mixing and placing and putting it on the surface. Indirect painting is really about the scenic route. And there's not one way to paint indirectly. There's a million ways, just like there's infinite amount of ways to paint. how far we draw out that process is really up to us. But it's kind of, there's some certain things that happen when we divide the process into, in this case, the underpainting and overpainting. It's a very simple division into two different segments. But in the underpainting, we'll be able to deal with the composition, the drawing, the values, independently of worrying about color. So that's kind of what's in the title. And we'll see how that plays out over the next couple hours. And, you know, we'll really welcome questions and feedback as we're going, or, you know, if there are questions at the end, I'm really happy to go as deep as people want to go. I tend to blue streak and just talk about these things.
Yeah.
I love.
Well, what we usually do is, you know, I'll be, you know, prompting you with questions here and there, which I'm sure you have a lot to talk about with any of them. But somewhere about halfway in, we're going to open up the Zoom call to anyone who's painting along with us and wants to actually get feedback and join the conversation. We've never had it get overly crowded or noisy. So that seems to work out really well in terms of just getting the whole class on board. So yeah, probably about an hour into it, we'll do that.
Cool. And I know that this is going to be recorded and put on the website. So that's sort of, I'm anchoring into that. I'm going to be jumping through a number of things. I don't need everyone to watch me do, you know, to make a stencil and do a drawing. So there's some things that I wouldn't expect that people will keep up with in real time per se, but to come back and revisit the video will be very useful, particularly perhaps in preparation for part 2 in 2 weeks.
Yes, and the other thing, David, that I wanted to talk to you about, not in too much detail right now, but I would really like to embed this in the painting section of Reinventing the Tattoo. And I thought maybe we could work on a chapter with some very briefly written out steps that would accompany this. I think that might help people to, you know, have their ducks in a row before starting and all that, which I know sometimes people feel this time pressure when there's these live broadcasts and they're trying to keep up.
Exactly. And in addition, I will say I'm going to make every effort to be really present on the app, on the social network, particularly leading up to the part 2 and after that. So if people have questions, I'm really excited to interact and, you know, be more personal there. So
yeah, and I want to also strongly encourage people who missed today's live broadcast to, over the course of this next couple of weeks, go ahead and catch up, watch this one and get their project started. So before part 2 begins, they'll be up and running. Yes, there is in 2 weeks. Michelle is she's working on a commission right now in the other room, which she's pretty excited about, but the timing isn't right for her to mess with new techniques today. But yeah, she's listening in from the other room.
Wonderful. And hopefully the 2 weeks will give us just a little bit of drying time. That's sort of, with the oils, that's sort of what we wanted to lean into as well. So
okay, so what are you using for a medium? Is this just going to be turpentine or?
For today, I've just got a 50-50 mix of turpentine linseed oil.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll get into that. I mean, it could just be turpentine. You could just use thinner. That would be fine for this layer. And often in the underpainting, medium may or may not even be necessary depending on how oily the paints are out of the tube. Mine, you can see they're, you know, sticking to the palette even at a vertical, so there's not a lot of oil dripping out of those. The cheaper paints will have oil kind of dripping out of it, and that's usually more than plenty to maneuver on the panel with.
What brand of paints are you using there?
I tend to go for Old Holland.
Yeah,
it's kind of lanky, but you know, they're expensive, but they're very pigment rich. And you
you get a lot more mileage out of a tube. I mean, I've had some Old Holland tubes for, you know, 10 years that I regularly use and just haven't run out.
You really just get what you pay for with paint. And it's nothing against cheap paint. I have all of it. I love cheap paint because you can just use it indiscriminately. And I love, you know, expensive paint because you kind of respect it more. You're like, okay, I'm going to use this really intentionally now. So
yeah, sometimes Michelle and I will wait till our final pass on a painting when we know that this is going to be the layer of paint that's going to be exposed and, you know, really seen the last thing before the varnish. And that's when we get out the blocks or whatever, the really high end stuff.
Right. Yeah, there's no point in putting your really nice paint on the bottom layer. It's kind of a waste, really. Yeah, keep the cheap stuff for the base layer, I think, in general.
I also see you've got a very simple palette there.
Absolutely. And I'm always kind of, there's a term less is more. I'm kind of less is less, and that might be better. Like I think Occam's razor comes into play. We can have a million colors, but is it just the art supply store making us think we need to buy all of those? Like, ooh, this one will make me a better painter. Ooh, no, that one. It's kind of like, I think when we can learn to do more with much less, then the options really just explode. And yeah, we can build our skills more rather than just build our arsenal more. Both come in handy.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you, because it can be that way with tattoo pigments also. It's like, yeah, you don't need all of them, but every now and then somebody will come out with a color. It's like, okay, this is an ochre with a tiny bit of green in it, and it's beautiful. I use this every day. Could I just pour ochre and green, or maybe mix my own bottles? Sure, but the fact that somebody made it and I'm attracted to it means I'll make tattoos that I like better. And it might be the same way with paint, especially if you lock onto a color, a particular hue that you really love, you don't want to have to mix that every time.
Right. If you can't live without it, I think it's important. One thing to be wary of that I've noticed with art supply stores is they like to gouge the price. We call them boutique colors. They'll take two cheap pigments, mix them together, and then suddenly it's this expensive tube of paint with a fancy name. You're suddenly like, wow, amethyst, that sounds really exciting. It's like, yeah, that's phthalo blue with a touch of alizarin in it. And, now they're triple charging you for it. So it's just something that I'm a little wary of economically. And I love the idea that, at least with paint, there's something about the variety. In tattoo, I think consistency is really important to know what you're getting. And I'm going to kind of keep trying to refer back between the two mediums a bit, because we can experiment a little more in paint. And yeah, if that violet goes a little more toward the red side or a little more toward the blue side, it's, we can alter that within even a given passage. And that can be really exciting in a painting, to have that variety when we're mixing our colors, maybe not even fully mixing them, letting them kind of have a bit of personality.
That could be desirable in a tattoo also, but it depends on the tattoo.
It's true. Well, yeah, I think a lot of room for exploration, and yeah, but that's why I'm keeping it very simple. So there will be repeatable results in a sense. I know when I was starting out painting, I'd mix some colors, the painting would dry, I'd try to come back to it. And for the life of me, I often couldn't remember what colors it took to actually mix something. But that's what got me started glazing and doing layered effects. So I could kind of, not just be trying to repeat what I had done in a previous session, but I could build on it and find some luminosity within that. So that's kind of, in a way, strangely, what got me started doing more layered techniques.
Yeah, well, that's definitely how, I like painting. I mean, tattooing that way. And I know Nick Baxter does a lot of that too. We let somebody heal and then come back and do a light pass over everything. We might push and pull a little bit, darken some things here, lighten a little bit here, warm it up, cool it down, make it look a little bit more opaque. And that's hard to always nail alla prima, so to speak, in that first pass.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel the same in painting. Like, it's a very different style to do alla prima painting or tattooing it than it is to do layered approaches. And I guess I'll say, just as we're beginning, I don't paint in any one way. I really love exploring the territory of painting, and from abstract to realist, classical realist, to sort of fantastic, hyperdimensional scenes. So what I teach is technique, not style, and it really comes back to principles of how people can use these tools and materials for their own goals. And
now, in your time away from tattooing, you have really sort of feasted on education, right? A very classical art education.
Yeah, quite a few different things. I mean, wow, I was self-taught painter for the first 15 years or so with oils, and then eventually I started realizing how valuable it would be to get some masterful downloads. So that looked at like egg tempera painting, like icon painting, both in Italian and Russian traditions, mixing egg tempera and oil paint, the mix technique, sort of the Ernst Fuchs visionary legacy, classical realism, modern, like plein air modern approaches, contemporary approaches. And then most recently, I graduated with a master's degree from London in traditional arts, which had a lot of things other than painting. but also including like manuscript illumination and miniature painting. And what's interesting to me is to see the common ground between all these different modalities. And there is a certain logic that flows through all these different mediums, regardless of what culture they're coming from or how old or new they are. So it's from all of those, that kind of the hybridization of all of those that I kind of build my, my arsenal of logic when I approach a painting. And that's, I hope to share with these two-part series for sure.
So did you put together some kind of a presentation for us to start this off, or have I missed it already?
Yep. I think Sandy was going to put that on, and we'll start with that presentation.
Would this be the right time for it?
This is the perfect time for it. Absolutely.
Tune in. Let's check it out.
Cool.
Right. Let me get that share screen going.
Cool. So we kind of looked at the title already and what's embedded in Alchemy of Indirect Painting. So we can move ahead. We'll move to the next slide. So first, looking at the anatomy of a painting, this is sort of a cross section of any given painting. This one, we're looking at the bottom, those circles in that, sine wave. You could see the warp and weft of a canvas. We might be dealing with a board or a panel or a piece of paper that's primed, or a number of different supports, but the basis is that it's the support. This is what the painting is going on top of. Above the support, we've got sizing, something that's keeping the paint, the oil paint in this case, from seeping into the support. Oil rots things. It will rot wood over time. So we need to put something as a protective layer, and that could be rabbit skin glue in the traditional sense. It could be shellac, a number of different things. If you're using acrylic primer, that's more the ground. That's the acrylic gesso, for instance, would be both the sizing and the ground. It's basically something that's going to protect the support from decaying over time. So the ground would be our gesso, and usually that's going to contain marble dust and be, or titanium white pigment, and be kind of that bright white surface that's reflecting light back through the colors at us. And you can see the ground is a bit thicker. There's kind of quite a layer of icing on top of the support and size that we can sand to a really fine, smooth surface. It's up to us how rough or smooth we want it to be, but in any event, that ground is really critical. So the support and the ground are kind of this, this pair. What are we painting on, and then how are we making the surface serve our desires and our needs?
So you've got 3 layers on there before you've even got some paint on.
At least, and some of those layers could be gone over many times. That ground, the gesso, maybe 8 layers sanded in between. I mean, it could be, you can get that to be like a nice, feel like just a stone surface, like as smooth as you could ever want it to be, or as rough as you want it to be. I've been playing with a lot of textural effects in my gesso lately after spending some time with the Turner exhibit in the Tate in London, just really kind of examining. Like, there's so much room for artistry even when you're doing the gesso, and I think we give this away too often to an art supply store. Go, oh, I bought the canvas, it's ready to go, without really considering, is that the ultimate surface that I want? So I would, many years ago when I was buying canvases, now I'm kind of a total snob. I make all my own stuff because I geek out on it, and I love that part of the process. But even if I buy a canvas at the store, I'd come back and gesso it and sand it a few times, and the surface would become much more interesting and much more conducive to fine work.
Yeah, and also the surfaces of pre-stretched canvases are often they're too porous, and often they're a little bit loose on the I definitely don't love the store-bought ones either.
Yeah. I use the word gauzy. They're a bit like cheesecloth or something. It's kind of,
it's hard to fill it with paint to a point where you start to feel like you're actually getting rolling. You're spending that first whole pass of it just trying to fill those pores.
Yeah, it really is. So there's really something about making our own surfaces. I think the creativity starts way earlier, and we have a much greater investment in the painting before we even begin. So I think there's something in that, definitely, that is not to be overlooked, really. So yeah, from there we're in the underdrawing, and that might just be a charcoal drawing, a pencil sketch. It could be a transfer from a photo, and you can see it's kind of broken. It's not a solid layer. There's some, this cross section, maybe there's chunks of ink, and there's a few different ways. I'll address that when we get into it specifically today. But on top of that, the imprimatura, and that's Italian for basically the first layer of paint. And we'll be doing exactly that on one of these particular panels today, where we just tone the entire ground as one shot. I mean, there's so often nothing more intimidating for artists than the blank white canvas. It sort of stares at us and haunts us. So the imprimatura is the way that we can get away from that blank white canvas and have some tone to work with, have some value. On top of that, what we would call the underpainting. You can see there's kind of a lot of chunky particles in there. It's a not a super thick layer, but it's definitely it's where we build up the mass, the body of the painting in a way. And we'll look at some strategies during the presentation for underpainting. Then it's saying main paint layers and glaze layers. It's sort of like, that's what we'd call overpainting, which we'll do in part 2 in 2 weeks. Is look how we're transitioning from what goes beneath to what comes on top and how they relate to each other. And then you get the final varnish, which is rather thin on the very top. And that's going to be a protective coat, hundreds of years later when the restorers are protecting your work, that'll be a layer that they remove and replace, for your, the posterity of your work. As you're immortalized as a painter. And the one thing missing in this particular diagram that I really like, that I've seen elsewhere, there's another layer that happens after the final varnish, and it's dirt and grime and all the stuff that sticks to your painting, because you better believe there's stuff and dirt and debris that will stick on top. So that's why it's nice to have a varnish layer, because you can ultimately clean the painting, remove the varnish, and reapply it. But I appreciated the diagram. It was in one of the reference books that I don't happen to have here that has that dirt layer listed as well. So a little cheeky, but we can move on to the next slides. And one of the things that really entertains me in a way is pigments are really, they're the basis of this work. And in alchemy, we have, the tria prima, the 3 primes. You have the salt, the sulfur, and the mercury, the salt being the body. And I really relate to the pigments being the body of our painting. It's the mass that the painting is made of. But in this case, looking at the pigments under a microscope, in this case, I think it was terre verte, or, the colors get a little bit skewed under the microscope, but you can see how crystalline they are. They're very, very translucent. We often think of paint as kind of this solid mass of color, but really when we're looking at it up close, light is refracting through those pigments. We can see more in the next slide as well. So here's probably like an azurite or some, this was in Vienna. They wouldn't speak to us in English at this time. This was many years ago in the long night of the museums when they'd stay open until midnight. So we're in the room with all these massive Rubens paintings looking at these pigments under the microscope. But you can see the variety of sizes. And this would be traditional pigments. So this would be like ground up rocks as opposed to.
Right, basically they're crystals.
Basically crystals, and we'll see that even more in the next slide, or the next 2 slides. But this is either chalk or lead white. I mean, just these granules, bizarre little. I mean, this is the natural world. We think paint comes from the store, but it comes from the earth, and particularly in handmade paints, you get a lot more variety than in the modern colors. So we can hit the next slide. We'll see it a little more of a gradation. Smalt is a blue glass that was used as a pigment. So we kind of get the close-up and then in the middle picture how it looks as a pigment, and then under the microscope on the right. And that absolutely looks crystalline. And that's sort of a synthetic one. It was a glass made into this beautiful sort of cobalt blue prior to actually having synthesized or extracting cobalt. And then below azurite, just the straight mineral, really pure mineral, which can be crushed up and the pure impurities levigated out through water washing, and then what you're left with is this pure pigment that, again, looks like crystal. I mean, not that surprising when it comes from a mineral to begin with, that it looks like that under the microscope as well. So we can move to the next. So as we're dealing with alchemical themes, lead being sort of what we start with in alchemy, lead to gold, there's a really intriguing alchemical process for making lead pigment using lead sheets that are curled up, placed atop vats of vinegar, and then they're sealed in a container. In this case, that top center container is sort of like beer brewing. So it's giving off, CO2, and it's interacting with the vinegar, and the vapors are corroding the lead, which is just turning into the sort of beautiful white frosting. Traditionally, that would be done over a sort of a structure full of horse manure or something. The vapors from that would interact with the lead and corrode it, and you get this glorious pigment. So this is one of probably the most ancient colors. I mean, you hear of lead white as it was like an early makeup color in Victorian era. Fill the pores of your face. Unfortunately, it was also eating away at the skin, so it was kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Just take more
Not to
on.
mention all the nerve damage.
You live and learn, I guess. But yeah, lead being a very interesting one. And I'll show some pigments after this, after the presentation. I'll try to hold some up. And lead being extremely toxic, but a glorious color to work with, a really lovely white. Today we're going to be using titanium for this painting practice. But lead white is really interesting. If you can have like solid cleanliness in your studio practice, I think lead is a fantastic white to work with. It's so transparent and really delicate for some soft effects. And all the history of painting up until like mid 1800s, all the white was lead and then a bit into zinc. But yeah, it's not to be overlooked, really. So there are a lot of toxic pigments that people don't think about. They get scared of lead, but they'll happily use cadmium. So I think it's just, let's have good studio practice and try not to stick our brush in our mouth if we can. Do our best, really. Take to the next slide. Just in terms of alchemical processes, sumi, and this is kind of interesting as it relates to tattoo as well, but made from the soot of pine branches, and then basically they're mixed with a binding agent, I think, which comes from a bone of some kind, basically, and basically it takes master craftsmen to really even produce the ink at all. And so just it reminds us so much that our pigments come from nature, whether it's minerals or whether it's vegetal origin or some animal origins, that it's all this relationship with the earth. And that's really, it does something for my brain to realize that it's not just blue or black. It's like, oh wow, this is calcined pine branch and the resins that come through that. It just builds a deeper relationship for me, a deeper mythos. It kind of builds some meaning into the painting as I'm doing it.
So if you want, Dad, I'm just doing my black outline. You can do that too.
The next slide, please. So we'll talk about underpainting a little bit. We'll come back to this slide in a moment, Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi. But here we're looking at two different paintings, actually, of the same topic. This is like this bizarrely eccentric backside of the Grand Odalisque by the French academic painter Ingres. And we're really lucky to be able to see both of these paintings. The underpainting on the left, completely done in grayscale, and I wouldn't say black and white either. Maybe it's hard to tell on the screen, but there's a little bit of color going on in there. I mean, there's warms and cools happening to a degree. So it could be a mixed black, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But then we know that the painting on the right was executed in such a way as the grayscale was done first, and then glazing and coloring happened on top of it. So it's sort of, it gives us a clue as to how the painting was executed, first dealing with values, first dealing with composition.
So do you think he was just unhappy with the underpainting somehow and decided to leave it?
That's a really good question.
Or Or maybe
Yeah, well,
because he was an academic painter, he decided it would be valuable to keep it as an example and just go ahead and do it twice.
yeah, it's such a good question. Maybe, maybe he realized he needed those peacock feathers in there first and a little fabric. I mean, I guess the thing with this, you can see the painting on the right, when the glazing is happening, there's not a lot of compositional changes that are happening there. And when you're looking at the sort of perfectionism of that style of painting, it would be very obvious if you kind of threw in a bundle of peacock feathers after. It would be obvious that it was, not planned well enough from the beginning. So perhaps there was an idea to change the composition a bit. Maybe that butt crack was too scandalous for the, 19th century
Yeah,
French school. Who knows?
it's still too scandalous for Instagram.
I know it. I know it. But you can really see what happens in the second painting, how much more luminous and rich, like the drapery, for instance.
So do you think these are photographed under similar circumstances, or are they actually right next to each other?
No, they're completely separate. It took some searching to even find these. And I've seen the colored version in real life, but I've not seen the grayscale one. I have no idea where that one is, but it's a very rare chance to see into the process of a deceased artist in this way.
Yeah, the sense of warmth is just so striking, and obviously you don't get that with the grayscale.
Right, and what appeals to me, and I think a thing to notice as we're going to move into some grayscale painting in a bit, is that on the left, the shadows, the black, is not brought all the way to its darkest value at all. There's a lot of restraint going on. The darkest dark is, maybe a 2/3 gray or something, not even that dark. And what it's doing is allowing for glaze colors to come on top of it and not only darken, but to deepen and make more transparent. So that's something I'm going to come back to, is the value, the light and dark, and the transparency, the relative opacity or transparency. And we're going to see that highlights are not only going to be lighter, but more opaque, much more solidly painted, and shadows, inversely, to be their opposite. We don't want the shadows to be a really solid color. We'd like to see them be transparent and sort of like you could reach your hand right in to the painting. So
right, you should see detail through it. Things like on those curtains, for example, you will see the fibers coming through the shadow.
Exactly. And yeah, it feels they're not only dark, but they're deep. The shadow should also be deep, and kind of, we can mimic that through layers of glazed paint. We can actually create that physical depth in the painting. So it's sort of like life art mimicking life, mimicking art, and back and forth. So we can move ahead. I've seen enough of her back end for now. So back to Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi. This is, we're going to experiment with something akin to this as well. You might call this, well, this is definitely his imprimatura. He's got the drawing going on. And if anyone's seen this actual piece in Florence at the Uffizi, there's a million finished paintings around, and this brought me to my knees, this unfinished painting. There's so much emotion and life in it, even though he never finished it, but you can really see the process of how he was going from a drawing, maybe an ink drawing, probably from charcoal first, to an ink drawing, and then basically building up this, what we call the brown underpainting. Ultimately, you see a lot of old classical work and we think, oh, it's all the brown paintings.
Now, isn't there a finished version of this one?
I don't know about this one particularly. There are a few different iterations of some of his work that, like a Virgin of the Rocks, for instance, was one he did a few different versions of. But this is sort of one that was abandoned, I think, in Milan for other pursuits. But I guess one of the things to note about the sort of classical palette, where we think, oh, it's all this brown paintings. One, they had a limited selection of colors at the time. And two, the logic of color, it really made sense. Unless you're in direct yellow, like golden sunlight, generally the light that's coming, whether it's, if it's reflected light coming in my window, it's a cool light, meaning, if you use white in a painting, it really reads as cool, as the brightest blue. And we'll prove that in part 2 of this series. But there's all these opposites. If the highlights are cool, then the shadows should be warm. Just like if the highlights are opaque, the shadows should be more transparent. So there's this sort of logic that really resonates through the work. And it makes sense to do this underpainting in these browns, and then often will leave the shadows. I mean, you can see he's developed the shadows first, and then would have come back in and ostensibly built up toward the highlights. It's all kind of conjecture. We don't really know how anyone has painted, but we are, lucky to glimpse some of these half-finished views.
Yeah, especially somebody like Da Vinci.
Oh my, yeah, just unbelievable, really. We'll move ahead. So speaking of the imprimatura, and that's what we'll do in one of our pieces today, the term means first paint layer. And basically it gets rid of that white, that glaringly white canvas or panel. And in a sense, it's definitely not an opaque layer. It absolutely wants to be transparent. And we should feel light permeating through that layer, bouncing off of our white gesso or our white surface, whatever that may be, and coming back to our eye. So there's sort of a glow, like this warmth that first layer gives us. And often that will be in a brown, earth tone, sienna, or an umber, or a red of some kind. I think of it as building the blood into the painting. You really want to give that heat first. It's so easy, particularly when we're mixing white into colors later on, that things get really cold. So it's useful to put the heat in right up front.
Yeah, I almost never use straight white because I find that it just looks dull. I almost always end up putting a little bit of yellow into it.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's so cold. And I love this exercise we'll do next time, that it basically proves that white acts as a blue. And you can see it when we mix colors next to each other. Like, oh my God, it is absolutely making things more blue.
Well, one really good example of that for people familiar with Giger's paintings is there is a very subtle warm and cool in his art. And the warm all comes from just India ink, which has that slight brown in it. And the cool all comes from the white airbrush paint, which is just white acrylic paint, because it does have that slightly bluish effect. And
Da Vinci noticed too, like sometimes even, paint companies will put a touch of blue into the white. We know that they do that. But if you're buying pure pigment, you know that it's unadulterated and it still has that same effect. Da Vinci noticed this amazing thing, which was that if you're looking at a horizon, a landscape, and the ground below the horizon line, the ground was dark, and of course above, the sky was lighter. If there was a plume of smoke coming up in front of this whole scene, when that smoke was it's just gray. It's like one color smoke, whatever it is, gray, brownish, whatever. When that smoke was in front of the land, it looked cool. And when that smoke was in front of the sky, it looked warm. So there's this sort of optical nature of things, whereas a light over dark, the smoke over the dark landscape, light over dark resulted in cooling, whereas that same sort of light gray over the lighter sky, which was a dark over a lighter, resulted in a warm look. So there's all these optics that he kind of intuited, but then had evidence for. And that's something that I want to hone in on. Not only our values of light and dark, not only our transparencies of, from opaque solid paint to really thin transparent, but the temperature shifts as well are a really fun thing we get to play with as painters. From warm to cool and cool to warm, and deciding what temperature our highlights are, what temperature our shadows are. And it gives a lot more range in our painting if we can hone in on that and start to observe.
Do you ever, sorry to interrupt, do you ever mess around with the specular halo on your highlights, like a little bit of color around the brightest part of it?
I love that. I love that seeing painters do it. I haven't focused on it too much in my work, but it's such a beautiful effect to see done well.
I was just referencing a post made recently by James Gurney, who it's this painting of a surface of water, and there's a highlight of the sun striking the water. And he even comments in this post how when you do this right, you might even involuntarily squint when you look at it. Yeah. Because we get this kind of specular halo in real life. We look at something and almost the brightest part is too bright for our retina. It almost burns out, right? It makes like a white area, and then around that you have this little exaggerated corona of color, like whatever the color of that light is around that highlight is like amplified by 3 times or something. And So when you manage to sneak that into the painting, it's really effective.
Amazing, right? I mean, when we look at the, when you once in a while gaze directly at the sun, yeah, the corona is brighter to our eye than, it's so hard to do in a painting. You want to think the sun is the brightest thing if you're doing a landscape, but to put a little bit of darker value on it, it somehow makes it more real than real. It's just wild.
Yeah, it's just this weird way that it affects our eyes. Our eyes are constantly adjusting and compensating. Our brain is doing tons of editing to everything that we see. And so, for instance, the way things are exposed, looking from a bright area to a dark area, your brain is scrambling to keep up, and it's doing quite a lot of editing there.
Absolutely. Yeah, your retina is kind of working overtime, certainly. Cool. So as we'll move, this is sort of what we'll look at today a little bit. The Bistra, the wipeout method. I always love that. That always cracks me up. Like you're totally crashing, you're wiping out. But no, whether we're doing this with a brush or whether we're doing it with literally a rag or a paper towel, we lay that undercoat, that imprimatura, in this case, just probably a sienna or an umber, and then come back in and pull the highlights back in through removing the paint. And that's really, like you're saying with Giger, that's keeping those lights very warm. If we were to put a stroke of white paint there, it would look blue in comparison. And that's what we want to look at as well.
All right. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have even thought of it that way, but being subtractive instead of additive. You're not only wiping paint out, but that tiny bit of it is being ground into that white surface.
Yeah, you're never going to get it all the way back off, or at least I have a little texture on this. There's no way it's coming all the way off.
Covering it with paint and wiping out to get that.
But the cool thing that we'll see that happens is you can get a lot of range of temperature, this sort of evasive temperature idea as compared to color and value, which are more obvious. We can play with a lot of delicate temperature by knowing that we can wipe out for the warm highlights. And then if we want to come in with some actual white paint, we'll see that it goes very cold and implies blue where there is no blue, and suddenly gives us a lot more range. Like we're saying with the limited palette, what can we do with fewer colors? So this would be one color and white, and we can already have a value map, the lights and darks. We can have a temperature map of the cools and warms, and a transparency map of opaques to transparent, all corresponding to each other within that one little color palette. And so that is intelligent underpainting to me. That really solves most of the issues of composition and drawing right off the bat. And then we can move into ideas of color and symbolism and maybe some of these more exciting overpainting issues. If we move forward. So this is a contemporary painter named Adrian Gottlieb, who is really so talented. It's kind of painful, really. And a lot of these are like one session paintings. He found that if he would take a lot of these paintings to completion and fully colorize them, it lost something of the raw expression that he would get from painting someone in a sitting or a few sittings. So all he's using is, he called this piambura, and piambo meaning lead, like, plum, lead, and imprimatura. He's kind of combining the terms for lead white. He's using that very transparent lead white, and he's using an imprimatura, a brown, looks like an umber in this case, kind of a burnt umber. And getting
he's just getting all the warm and cool from the two pigments.
In general, yeah. I mean, maybe the third one might be like a raw sienna or something. There's a little bit more life in the brown there, but
yeah, it looks like it's got more warm in it.
But yeah, he's doing way more with way less, and he found that he just kind of killed it, like it just squeezed the life out of a painting when he would overwork it sometimes. And he could do a commission in one shot if he did it like this, and it seemed like that was sort of what inspired him to figure it out to begin with, was necessity. On the next slide, we have a few more of his pieces, and you can kind of see his process. And certainly, moving from the sketch on the left with that toned ground, the second image, he's built up the lead white really delicately in the flesh.
So he's not doing any wipeout necessarily. It looks like it's all being built up with the whites.
Yeah, he's really just letting the shadows be the shadows and the highlights be the highlights, and kind of, yeah, exactly. Really pushing that contrast. And the third one, he's really just laid in the shadows fully, like massive chiaroscuro. And then he finally lays in the flesh tones. And between the third and the fourth one, like you can kind of see it goes from almost more classical look in the second and third image to like this very modern, almost too photographic. I mean, really well painted, but you can see why he might have wanted to hold back on that a little bit and have a little
Yeah.
more of a romantic painting, rather than sort of a photographic look. But it really,
I mean, they both look good, but that slightly exaggerated chiaroscuro look is, which to people not familiar with that term, there's this heavy mottled shading. It's more dramatic, definitely. It flattens out a little bit with that color treatment.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting. Suddenly we're in a photograph instead of a painting. It's interesting. But nonetheless, you can see how little is happening by the time he's actually colorizing the flesh. He's not making any compositional decisions. No values are changing. No major decisions are being made. He's just sort of warming the flesh minimally.
Just a tiny bit of glaze.
Just a breath. Absolutely. So that's something that we're considering as we're looking at underpainting and overpainting, that a lot of the decisions, the heavy decisions, are being made in the underpainting, ideally, if we're looking at this sort of theme anyway, this style. Just wanted to mention another technique, at least for painting skin tones, is verdaccio. And verdaccio literally meaning like bad green, kind of like ugly green. But it ultimately amounts to putting the complementary color in the flesh. Like if we only paint skin in pinks and oranges, like we can get this very plasticky kind of very strange opaque looking skins. So the way that at least the classical painters dealt with that was putting green in the flesh first, and then overpainting with the reds into the sort of peachy oranges. And the way these are works from my egg tempera instructor, Fred Wessel, in the Italian tradition. He said you should feel the green, not see the green. You should feel it tempering the warm colors underneath, and mostly you'd feel it in the shadows where the flesh tones are allowed to be more transparent still, whereas he's building up more opaque into the highlights again.
So it kind of reminds me of, I was looking at some landscape paintings. I wish I could tell you the name of the artist. I've been following a lot of landscape painters. This was a painting of snow. And they had explained that they had laid down this sort of medium steel blue everywhere, and then just did all the building up with warm whites. And you didn't really see much of the blue except where they'd left it in the shadows. Mostly it was pretty warm, but that blue was so instrumental in being able to make the warm whites work that way.
Yeah, it's so wild to, often you think, I know what color the certain part of the painting needs to be, and for the first half of your painting, you're putting the exact opposite color there so often than what you're going to end up with. But there's something really, once we get used to that formula, there's something very comforting in the logic of it. Going, oh, I put its opposite there, or at least some, a different temperature there, and then I can build off of that, and it gives us much more range. Whereas if someone was painting snow on a white canvas, how would you even do it? It's just sort of white already. So we have to pull away from where we're ending up in a, sort of paradoxical manner.
Well, and if you just start with that white on the canvas as the white in your snow, you're just never going to arrive at that subtle, layered, realistic presence.
Not at all. I mean, light is so complex. Seeing light bounce off of objects, I think as we observe nature, there's so much to learn. Anything you look at, I think we're blessed as artists because we can really just partake of, the beauty that's all around us. No matter what we're looking at, we can always learn from even the most mundane objects. You can always kind of understand what's the temperature of the light and how's it affecting the colors, and whether it's local color or in the shadows. And it's like we can always be studying no matter where we are. This is a demo. This is the head of our skeleton. I think her name is Morticia, but this is just a quick demo, a little color mixing exercise on the left. And we'll do a little bit of something similar to this today. In this case, it was just using ultramarine blue and a burnt sienna, which is a nice complementary pair. meaning they neutralize at something akin to a black, a chromatic neutral. And so we see, ultramarine pulled out to white on the top, burnt sienna pulled out to white on the bottom, and then their ensuing mixtures. And that center row is sort of like, the gray that this demo was based on.
Right, it's almost totally neutral.
It really does neutralize. You can, and the thing I like about, as opposed to just mixing black and white, you can still get a gray, but you could push it slightly cooler if you needed to in a certain area for emphasis, or slightly warmer. And so there's a lot of range that becomes available to us when we do these graduated color mixtures. And I find it really empowering to mix color in that way. So this whole painting was just created with that palette. You can really kind of see how the colors translated, and none of the bright blues were used, none of the full throttle burnt siennas were used, and only maybe a little bit of that second from the top row and the second from the bottom. Mostly it was just in that middle gray area, and you can slightly push it cooler or warmer for emphasis. So there's
like I see how you warmed up the book cover just so that it would separate from the skull more.
Yeah. I mean, it's just fun to play with, how narrow of a bandwidth can we still find nuance and subtlety when we're so used to, blasting out color. Like, I mean, I'm guilty of it, for sure, of like overusing color. When I look at mountains, that landscape, seeing the distant atmosphere, I tend to go too blue with it. And in life, it's like, oh, it's actually pretty gray still. It's just a coolish gray that gets that effect. And we can emphasize those colors to our own ends, but I think it's empowering to be able to speak to that visually with smaller range, a compressed range of color. It can be, good exercise anyway. So that's kind of what we're looking at today. We'll use a different color palette, or at least I will be. And, there's different options there that people can use to create that grisaille and still have a lot of that temperature information going on. So looking at toned grounds, these are just a few little studies that happened over the winter. On the left, that ground was probably more like a ochre, probably yellow ochre, Indian yellow mixture. Often if I have paint left over on my palette at the end of the day, instead of tossing it or letting it dry out, I'll use it as the background color for some panels that I've prepared. Particularly if you have a weird muddy color, like just mix them all together and slap it on there, it becomes really kind of interesting.
Back to the idea of alchemy, there you're taking, your leftovers would have gone in the garbage can and allowing it to sort of randomly influence the foundation of your next piece.
Absolutely. I mean, how valuable is that? I don't know if people have seen those tubes of Torric gray that Gamblin makes. They give out when you buy art supplies. Sometimes they'll give out this tube of gray, and it's different all the time, but basically it's Gamblin taking all their leftovers when they're cleaning their machines, just mixing it into one massive batch and bottling it up and giving it away. And some painters swear by these tubes. It's like, these are so valuable. So we can do that ourselves ultimately at the end of every painting day, and then we don't have to clean the palettes the next day, this repentance that we have to do later on. So basically what I'm trying to get at with this slide is that the ground really brings a lot of not only warmth, but a translucency, sort of a depth to the shadows. And I've just been building up, I just built up the highlights. Probably the size these are on people's computer is actually about as big as these paintings are. They're tiny. But I really just could allow the shadows to be that warm, transparent ground color, and then just build certainly some darker accents, but mostly building towards the cool, opaque highlights. So we're thinking warm, transparent shadows and cool, opaque highlights. It's sort of this axiom that once we start to notice it, it becomes obvious that paint wants to do that anyway. The highlights want to be cooler, they want to be thicker, and the shadows want to be warmer. And deeper. So it sort of happens naturally, which is really kind of a blessing. But we can lean into it. We can lean into it a bit. We can move on one more. This was the similar thing, a toned ground. And this was an alla prima, I guess what you call it, extended alla prima. meaning direct painting with a toned ground. Not starting just from a white canvas and placing everything on it, but starting with a little bit of brown, probably in the upper left background, and kind of attacking it from there. So in a way, there's this whole spectrum, as I mentioned before, from direct to indirect painting. And this is maybe one step away from pure direct painting, where you at least start with a tone, a warm tone in the background that just gives a little bit of depth to the shadows. So you can sort of leave the shadows thinner and focus on painting more thickly in the highlights.
So just out of curiosity, are these panels or are these canvases that you just built up your ground so much that you can't see the
These are linen. Basically, I had little pieces of birch plywood that I glued linen or canvas to, and then I built up the gesso on top of it thick enough to where you can't see the weave anymore, basically, and like frosting a cake. Just kind of.
Okay, so what would be the advantage of using the linen rather than just building up the gesso directly on the panel?
Ultimately, it's longevity, and not that that's our main concern in the modern day. But for instance, a panel, if you just gesso right on the panel, that panel could be subject to humidity and moisture warping, and the gesso can crack off of that over time, because the gesso doesn't really want to move that much. It kind of wants to just stay where it is. So by wrapping it, by gluing fabric, could be muslin even, or linen or canvas, the weave of those fibers basically takes the warp. It adjusts to the warp over time. So if you have a board that's getting exposed to humidity and it's kind of expanding and contracting, it's actually it's protecting the gesso from cracking.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, the cracks can't happen because there's a whole protective layer between the gesso and
that's it. And it's not to say I haven't done plenty of paintings straight gessoed on panel for sure, and they haven't cracked, in 10 or 15 years, but so much of these ideas come from traditional painting concepts where they were planning on their paintings lasting hundreds and hundreds of years. So we can really sort of rely on the scientific experiment of these older painters. And
one time Michelle did this very elaborate, must have been 100 hours of painting she put into this mandala, and we didn't know any better. We had just cut a circle out of plywood and gessoed it up nice and heavy and sanded it. It was perfectly smooth, but yeah, didn't take long before those cracks started appearing.
It happens to the best of us, and the irony is, most of us grew up and figured out learning acrylic gesso, and it's taking time it's much more complex to get into traditional methods. Who knows how long our paintings will last that we're done with, acrylic primers. The medium's only been around 60 years or something.
Right.
Whereas, these older mediums have been around hundreds, if not thousands of years. So there's something, if we care about them standing the test of time, and it's not a judgment whether we do or not. Some people geek out on it. Some people just want to paint. It's just what we have the attention span for. But to answer your question further about the linen or canvas, in the scenario of a restoration, often the wood will rot out from behind a painting, and that linen can basically the wood can be sort of liquefied and dissolved from behind the painting, and that linen can be mounted to another piece of wood 500 years after the painting was done.
I've heard of that happening. Yeah.
So whereas if you were just trying to take the paint off of a board, you'd be pretty hard pressed to do it, I think. So it's all for our immortality, if we're concerned about I always get a chuckle out of that. I don't think
I try not to worry about that too much, but I remember that sometimes the people that buy my paintings might be thinking differently about them. So
it's true. I mean, there was the one isolated story of Odd Nerdrum using motor oil for his painting medium for a series of big paintings, and they all fell apart, and he got kind of in some deep issues with his collectors and had to repaint all these big works. The experiment is, interesting to a point, but if there's a lot riding on it, yeah, it may be better to stick with the tried and true, methods. So looking at just another way of underpainting to overpainting process, from the upper left that was just like black and brown oil paint. Kind of painted like really dark. The things that were going to be light later, I painted really dark first because I just wanted this sort of a visceral solidity to them and to get a lot of that texture in there. That second image, the smaller one, I did more of that, kind of random background over the whole thing, knowing that I had enough contrast between the hand and the flower versus the white background that no matter what I did on top of it, if it had a little bit of transparency to it, I could get away with a whole lot in the background. And then I reestablished all the lights and all the color at the end.
You totally flipped your pos-neg relationships there.
I did. Yeah, it was really, again, it's not how I always would paint, but just to kind of show one way that it could be done. And it's sort of this doing the opposite of what you think you're going to do. Like I wanted to get texture in there. I wanted to get, like, in order for those yellows and the whites to be really gleaming, I sort of needed something to build them off of.
So you put yourself in a position where you had to build up a lot of paint to get it there. So you couldn't just allow for the panel to show through with a few hints of paint here and there to suggest the texture. You had to actually build it up like that.
Exactly. And I think there's 3 stages in this painting. One is the background being completely transparent. I mean, there may be a couple little jeweled highlights, but it's really just those like transparent blues. The hand is sort of halfway between. There's still some really transparent parts of the hand, particularly in the shadows. And then the flower goes to like full opaque, thicker paint. So I'm really separating transparency from translucency into opacity. And those are kind of the 3, I'd look at 3 stages ultimately. So transparent shadows, translucent halftones, those midtones, and then opaque highlights. Yeah. So move ahead. So looking at another grayscale, this is actually an egg tempera painting I did of my wife, Aloria, and
it looks like an airbrush painting.
Nice. Yeah, if we got close enough on it, we'd see all these like little micro hatching brush strokes, as you see in the bottom left.
Yeah, I see that. That's now the entire surface looks like that.
Yeah, but microscopic, kind of tiny brush strokes. That's sort of what the Italian egg tempera style did. It was just very draftsman-like, rather than blending. You couldn't really blend the egg tempera. You just sort of place it on each stroke. So in this case, the underpainting is all just in ink. It's just India ink, and then the overpainting, egg yolk mixed with pigment. And that's pretty much the whole thing. Even though it's not an oil painting, the concept holds true. And in this one, I also did green in the sort of greens and all kinds of different colors in the flesh before. And there's still a lot of colors shining through the skin tones. It's not just sort of reds and pinks. There's like purples and blues and greens and all kinds of different colors in there, which we do see in the flesh if we really look. I mean, skin is not a solid opaque object. It's this translucent medium that has blood and plasma and all kinds of, organic matter going on underneath it. So there's something.
I think a lot of it is when we look at something, we see the dominant color, and that's what we identify as being. And
right.
There's this scene in that movie, The Girl with the Pearl Earring. Have you seen the movie?
I don't know that I've actually seen it.
Okay, this is about Johannes Vermeer, and he had this assistant played by Scarlett Johansson, and he asked her, "What color is that cloud?" She says, "Well, it's white." He says, "No, really look at it." And so then, once she's been forced to think about it a little bit more, she's like, "Okay, I see yellow in there. I see some pinks in there. I see a little tan in there. A lot of things, but beyond like that, the obvious like knee-jerk reaction." So, I mean, anything you look at is just layered with different nuances of color.
Absolutely. I mean, we've kind of been, handed this very grade school way of looking at color. Like, what color is it? Oh, it's blue. Like, as if that means, as that means anything compared to what our eye is actually perceiving. We're seeing in so much detail. And I really I'll bring it up in part 2 in a presentation, the color sphere, not looking at the color wheel as though our color choices are made of 6 options only, but those, that red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, that's like the outer equator on an earth of color that goes from white at the North Pole to black at the South Pole, gray in the center, and every nuance in between. And that's really the territory we're looking at. And these, the bright colors are just such the tip of the iceberg, really. So neutralizing our colors is such a key piece. Here's a piece by Aloria, underpainting on the left and the overpainting in the right. And you can see she's just worked out everything in the neutrals. And this is more like the Piambura that we were looking at earlier, where it's the lead white for the highlights and the umbers, the raw umber for the shadows. And she just meticulously worked out everything before adding a drop of color. And then it just makes the finishing of the painting really straightforward, and like how striking that red, fabric on the head is, because it's, it's sort of a glaze of red on top of this really luscious value map.
So by the time she starts coloring, like looking at that image on the left, what percentage of the work that ultimately got done on this painting do you think is represented there?
Like 90%, 95 probably.
Okay, so really the underpainting is the big job, and that glazing and color is sort of like the cherry on top.
At least for this kind of portraiture, at least for this sort of classical realism, I think that we can still be very creative with underpainting as it relates to overpainting, let's say in more visionary works. I think it can be more dynamic than that, but for something as photorealistic as this, as real to life as it is, it makes sense to work out as much of it. Kind of like a tattoo, you'd really work out your drawing before you're going to put it on skin. It'd be really nice to not have mysteries when you're trying to apply it. And I think that really relates to this style of painting as well. It was about execution, not about the discovery or the creativity of the process. It was about this precise execution. So yeah, really controlled in that way. Here's a collaboration between Aloria and myself, Pandora. And you can see our brown underpainting, that's sort of like sienna. We had the ink drawing. This was all like hatching ink on a panel, where basically it was black and white before it got to this stage, but then a glaze of, whether it was a mixed sienna and umber, probably just straight sienna if I'm knowing myself, to give that warm tone, to make the shadows really warm. And then, there was a little more color. In this case, the underpainting didn't go as far as the last slide we just saw. Just, went to about halfway. The composition is there. All the shadows aren't fully built in yet. And there was a little more of a visionary color palette. It wasn't meant to be realistic flesh tones. So there was a bit more play in the overpainting. There's sort of these cool, hazy, half tones underneath the hands, underneath the arm on the right side. And, a little bit more experimentation in the overpainting, a little more play with it. So I think it doesn't have to be so rigid in the underpainting. Kind of like, you get the idea, you get where the shadows are, the composition is there. There's still light shining through that imprimatura on the left. It's definitely light hitting the gesso of the panel and bouncing back through our eye that's giving those lights. And then only on the finished piece on the right do the highlights get more opaque.
Yeah.
So there's an interaction.
So basically what you're showing between this and the previous example is that you could go really far with your underpainting to the point where it's almost a photo that needs colorizing, and then, or you could take it halfway there, or even just part way there. There's no right answer there.
You got it. It's just sort of what works for our own process, I think, is the most important thing. I'd like to just, share principles rather than dogma, like, here's how we could split the composition on one half and then the execution on the other. Like, have there be fewer mysteries by the time we're getting into the colorization. So we're not dealing with the values and the composition while we're trying to also, be really creative and liberated with color. So it just sort of splits the task in two in a way, and allows the finishing of the painting to be maybe a little more loose and a little more expressive, because we're not solving major issues related to how it's going to work. Then we can kind of get into, a little more bravado with the brush strokes, perhaps. But, there's more ways to paint than there are humans. So there's really no right way.
Yeah, I think that the important thing is to not leave yourself with important compositional problems that are unsolved, but to make sure to leave yourself with enough room to explore and experiment and discover, and find that sweet spot in between, being prepared enough to where you're not going to slip and fall, but not too prepared to where when you get to that final process, there's nothing left to, enjoy doing. It's just rote execution.
Exactly. There's a term, pentimenti. It's a painter's repentance. Basically, when you didn't work out your composition correctly in the underpainting, and then you try to cover it later. It's the idea that if you had a black and white checkerboard and you painted over it completely with white paint, eventually, given enough time, that the oil paint will become somewhat transparent, more transparent over time, and those checkers will come back through. So, time will judge us, basically, is kind of what it's getting at. Like, sort of like work out your composition first and try not to change it too late in the game. At least that's like a classical ideal. We're living in a different time and anything goes these days. I actually thought it'd be interesting to make a painting where in 100 years, there's something that's revealed by that transparency coming through, like actually put something there that you cover over intentionally. So,
it's kind of funny. There's this Dali painting at the Art Institute where they have to have a photograph next to it to show you the little blue dog that used to be there.
Right.
But it absolutely vanished. There's no hint of it.
It happens. Funny you should mention Dali. These are our final two slides.
I love this book, by the way.
Oh, this is critical reading. That
was the first time I encountered the idea that, yes, you should use black in your paintings. And in fact, here's how each type of black is different and what they're good for. It's like, oh, wow, okay. That kind of turns that idea on its back.
It does. I mean, there's so many gems of painting in here. And yes, you have to swim through a lot of surrealist banter to actually try to ascertain that there's wisdom that he's delivering. It took me 15 years to figure out that there was so much good information in this book. At first I was just like, he's just messing with us. But he's just veiling it. He's hiding it for those who can permeate. What he's showing us here is basically his underpainting palette on the left and his overpainting palette on the right. And without going too deep into it, I'll just point out that he's using basically a red, a blue, black, and a yellow, like a primary triad, we would call that, and then blanc d'argent, like lead white. So he's using a red, yellow, blue, and white for his underpainting. And then on the right, his overpainting. Well, the other thing I'll say about his underpainting, that red and more or less, those colors are a little bit more opaque. They're a little more chalky. They're going to be heavier. And then in his palette on the right, he's using a lot more diversity of color, but also a lot more transparent color. And so he's basically just tinting by the time he gets to the overpainting. This is the long and short of what we're seeing here.
Right. And for people who are still trying to grasp what the purpose of the underpainting is, it's not so that you can do the whole painting twice. The idea is to set yourself up so that final stage of painting is about just, glazing in those little bits of color, adding those final details, those key highlights, but everything else is figured out. You're setting yourself up to have that magic moment towards the end where it all comes together.
Exactly. You get very subtle at the end. Yeah, it's really a setup for success. It's kind of like doing the grunt work ahead of time when you have the energy for it. And I think it's great to have multiple paintings going on. Sometimes you're in the mindset of just, all I want to deal with is light and shadow today. And that can be really where your mind is at. And other times, you're ready to be mixing all these different colors and working with every possibility. So I think it's honest. It's an honest way of painting in a sense. There's one more slide. I mean, he kind of goes into it again, this time more simply, saying the secret of the colorist. And on the left, again, he's got it's so hard to permeate these a little bit, but he's got basically, his yellow, his white, a blue, and looks like kind of browns and violets. Basically, he's got the reds, the yellows, and the blues are present in his underpainting again. And then in the overpainting, in this case, he's literally got a transparent yellow, aureolin, like extremely bright yellow, an ivory black, and a white. And he's just kind of what he's saying is the secret of the colorist is, can you do more with way less? Like how much range can you give yourself with these very few colors? So in a way, that's sort of my challenge to us today with underpainting is how much can we do with how little? And whether that's brown and a wipeout technique and a highlight, or whether it's mixing some chromatic neutrals to mix our own grays and play with that. That's sort of the challenge in essence.
Okay, well, before we get started, should we give people a minute to stretch? And I'm gonna have to grab my charge cord. That's why you have 2 more panels. And so, okay, anything else that people need to get together right now?
You know, I'm sort of going to skip ahead on my process. What I would say is, I'll just kind of say where we're at and what I've done here. I used a bit of India ink. In this case, it was a Sennelier. I used a brown, it's a walnut brown, just to give myself the line work of my composition on this piece. On the other one, I basically transferred a drawing in charcoal, and I'm just going to leave it as the charcoal lines. This one we're going to do as the bistra, so I wanted the lines fixed there, so the India ink won't come up once we paint over it. So if people wanted to take a minute and do some line work, you know, granted, I don't expect everyone to be flying through it as quick as possible. I imagine it might be helpful to watch this video again once it's posted. But I've given myself the line work here. In indelible.
I'll show you what I've got so far. I'm just going to be painting my hand today. I'm keeping it pretty simple. I figured that would probably be a good demo for the wipeout technique.
Cool.
Kaya has been painting a dragon patiently while we've been going through this presentation. It's looking pretty rad. It's kind of cool because in January, you know, we did all these still life paintings, and she did one every day too, which was anytime anyone at any age wants to, you know, learn a lot about painting, just do it every day for a month, even if it's just 2 hours, and you'll get it. Let's see. Yeah, here's Kaya's dragon so far.
Wow.
But yeah, what happened with that month is she got to a point where she could paint something like this with oils without making mud, which, you know, that's a huge, you know, gateway to get yourself through when you're learning oil painting.
It really is. It's huge.
I'm gonna go grab my charge cord, and I guess everyone else who is following along, get yourself ready. And I guess should we give people time for a step away bathroom break?
Yeah, take 5 or whatever period of time.
3 or whatever. And well, that's how long it's gonna take me. So I will see you in a moment.
Cool.
What if I make you fish sticks and I see you guys go back? Okay, I'll call you when it's ready, okay? When it's ready, you guys come, okay? You're ready very soon. It's just the booster. Like that.
Hey, for those who are just tuning in right now, we're just taking a couple minutes break to get situated. And then we're going to actually start our hands-on part of our demo today.
And if anybody's got any questions, you're more than welcome to put those in the chat and I can pass those on to David. So there was a lot of information, really cool information. If there was any questions on that before we're starting, you can ask those now.
And certainly if things come up later after this session, I'll do my best to be available on the app, and feel free to connect with me there. And sort of careful what you ask. I go down the rabbit hole and probably give more information than you ever wanted.
Oops.
Okay.
So Guy, on your piece, is that just a drawing or is it committed with ink at all? I'm just curious.
This is just a pencil sketch. It's
Okay.
It's very light. When I paint from life, I often don't even do that. I just start cutting in with the brush and hoping for the best.
Cool.
And I usually will work with a pretty big brush too for most of it.
For this, I could see, well, for instance, I committed my lines with ink. Even a pencil, it would, even a dark line would be sure to stay. On this, we're just going to give a very full, pretty even coat of paint over the whole thing, and then work on wiping out from there. So it'll be, in essence, important that our lines are visible and
Gotcha.
stick around.
So basically what you're saying is it wouldn't hurt if I were to darken this a little bit.
You could darken them, make sure they stick around. I just committed mine with a brown ink. You could do a black India ink. Just as long as it's not like charcoal and going to wipe right off. Often, if we're talking about archival technique, graphite is it's a lubricant. It's kind of shiny and things don't stick to it as well. So often that's sort of why I would lean towards ink, for instance.
Right. The only reason I'm doing this is because I'm kind of used to the idea that as I paint, my line work is going to just kind of melt into the paint and become one with it. And I've learned to work with that as a good thing, but I think for other people, it might be a confounding thing. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying. You want to get it down in such a way that you're not all of a sudden without valuable information. I'm just giving myself some flexibility because I know I've got all the information I need here in life. I can always refer to my hand, but
right.
I might make mistakes in my drawing, and if I commit it with ink, it'll be harder for me to rectify those.
Exactly.
So maybe I'm just being wishy-washy about it, but yeah, I hear what you're saying, that you don't want to end up without your information. And this is something that, Michelle and I have spent, our years painting side by side, trying to figure out, like, how do you do that? How do you make it so that in your first pass of painting, you're trying to just rough it in, not get too lost in the rendering, but by the time you're done with it, your drawing is kind of gone, and it's easy to get lost if you're not careful.
Yeah, like the same as tattooing. Like you can lose your stencil, and then you're in a whole other world.
Right? Yeah.
Chasing it around.
You better
Painting
really be comfortable with drawing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea that we can go from really loose to really tight in a painting, or vice versa. And it's sort of like just knowing your process. Like for instance, I'm starting pretty much rigid with these outlines, but what I would like to get to by the end of this painting is something much more loose and painterly. And because it's so tight right now and rigid and defined, by the time I get to the overpainting, I can kind of, you know, use a lot more impasto, like thicker paint and more expressive brushwork, because I know that I'm basically trying to get away from it being such a, you know, an outline drawing. I don't want to see any of these lines by the end of the painting at all.
Right. So you're gonna have to bury them.
Exactly. But you'll see how it works very easily. It will be very easy to bury that, given what we're going to do. And the opposite could be true. You could start kind of loose, rough it in, and then by the end, you might hit a crescendo of really tight detail in a couple little focused areas. So loose to tight or tight to loose can both be really good strategies. And it just comes down to our own working style. And I guess that's really, you know, I want to emphasize that again. There's not one way to paint. These are ideas, these are concepts, and we can apply them in ways that really make sense to us. But all we're doing is dividing the labor into basically composition and then rendering. And they sort of blend together in the middle, certainly. But it's a division of labor that different parts of our brain can grasp at. And in what way that happens is going to be unique for everyone. Absolutely.
We've got someone in the chat room just wondering, what are the 4 colors that you have up there right now?
Great question. And these we'll get to for our next painting. These won't come into play just yet, but that's a perfect time for that question. This is alizarin crimson on the bottom. It's really hard to see. It's just so dark. This is Indian yellow, and it looks less like a yellow and more like an orangey brown, but it's because it's a very transparent color.
I love that color.
Oh, so good. And then ultramarine blue. So this is what I call my transparent primary triad. And it doesn't have to be these colors per se, but this red is very transparent and will immediately make like really dark violets when mixed with the blue, or really dark oranges when mixed with the yellow. And same, you know, it's a very transparent yellow. It's not going to be the color of the sunshine by any stretch. So these are transparent, and you know, I'll sort of hold off on what we're going to do with them, because we'll get into that in the next exercise. But for this, and this is titanium white. For this exercise, I'm just using burnt sienna. I'm putting in a little dish because I'm going to make what I lovingly refer to as brown sauce now, to do this imprimatura, that first layer of paint that's going to cover this entire surface. And I'll mix some of this oil medium with it here momentarily, and then we'll apply it to this entire piece, somewhat indiscriminately, somewhat just smoothly across the whole surface. And then we'll do a little color mixing exercise for our next painting using this transparent primary triad.
Nice. Well, I've got my brown sauce. Now,
All right.
should it be fairly translucent or?
Yeah, we want this. Yep. Yeah, we want a translucent sauce, basically. If it's too opaque, I'm just pouring some of my 1-to-1 turpentine and linseed oil into my dish. You know, we want this to be transparent. We're going to want to see the light of the gesso shining through. If we go opaque, 1, we're going to cover up all our lines. And then 2, like, the whole point of doing this is that we're creating these warm shadows. We're sort of setting the stage for the shadow transparencies, like we saw in the wipeout method, basically, is what we're doing. So it's sort of like brown sauce, and we're going to wipe away a little bit of highlights and see how warm those highlights look compared to when we place some titanium white in the composition as well. So we won't take this painting super far. I'll get far enough so we can see how you might develop it on your own, and then we'll switch to the other grisaille, the grayscale. And then we'll have a couple of different working methods of paintings that people can work on before part 2 of this class in a couple weeks. I'll be working on mine as well. I'll post updates in the app and stuff, and kind of keep a dialogue going on with people.
Yeah, I'll try to do the same. Got a few parallel projects going on, but I definitely want to get some development on these.
Yeah,
I've been asking people to do these, the Monday night exercises every week, and they've been putting a lot of hours into them. By the time we see each other the following week, there's some impressive bits of work that they've done.
absolutely. It's really awesome to learn from each other that way too. I mean, I think everyone's going to approach these things slightly differently, and it's one of the things I really miss about having in-person classes is we don't get to learn in real time from each other in the same way. But in any event, I've got my brown sauce guy's got his sauce going on, and I might test a little area in the corner just to make sure it's as luminous as I want, and that I can still see my lines underneath. Kind of an important point for where I'm at. Looks okay. I don't want it to be super dark because we want to be able to push shadows darker. But a nice rich walnut. I think of this like staining furniture. This is not the creative part of the process at all. This is like kind of being a robot. And we're just trying to get a value rather consistently. And you could do this in so many different ways. If you really like playing with texture, if that gives you some more information in your painting, if texture isn't and micro detail is important for you in your composition, now would be a great time to be able to get that. You could apply a lot more haphazardly as long as you're covering the surface well. You can get a lot of brush strokes in there if you chose to. And certainly we don't have to just use one color. This is, you could have a mixture and make it a lot more interesting. But I think the point of this particular approach is that it's warm, it's transparent, and it's clearly darker than the white surface. So we've got our value, temperature, and transparency all engaged in one layer. And there was only one place we were going to go from the white. The white is cool, it's light, and it's pretty solidly opaque. There was only one direction to go from there, which was darker, warmer, and transparent. And I'm kind of a broken record on those three: value, temperature, transparency, because I feel like if you nail those in a painting, if you get your light and dark correct, if you get your transparent and opaque correct, and you get your temperatures right, you have a lot of freedom to play with color and do whatever you want. You can do the most bizarre colors for flesh tones as long as they're hanging together in a way that makes sense to the eye. With those three, I find, are just the most important.
It's kind of like with a tattoo. If your design has got strong, decisive use of value, the color, I don't want to say it's anything goes, but you certainly have a lot more freedom. Where if your value scheme is not super strong, when you go into a color, you're going to have to really work a lot harder to make sure that things don't get muddy.
Yeah, I think all the color in the world, all the the dazzling color in the world will never save a poor value map. If you don't nail that realism, like light never changes. Light never decides, oh, I'm going to actually work in the opposite way as I did yesterday. Light is so consistent in our reality that we can walk around and not fall into stuff usually. We can rely on it. It's a constant. So it's sort of like mimicking the way light and shadow works in nature in our painting. You can see I've got this kind of very boring flat layer, but that's in essence what I was aiming for. And then I'm going to let that sit for a moment and consider where I want to pull some highlights back in with this wipeout technique. And people will use all different kinds of things for this. You could use like cotton ear swabs to get some nice control and pull back some highlights. might just use a corner of a paper towel. And I'll use my reference and kind of look at different areas where I can certainly afford to pull back in some highlights and just start scrubbing at it a little bit. Yeah, you can see that a little bit there. I'm just, in essence, shading by removing. And you can use brushes for this. Sometimes they work better than others. Stiffer brushes might work a little better. Soft brushes can work good for certain details. I mean, you could spend quite a bit of time removing paint, blending paint, and detailing in this stage and get really far in a painting with just one color and a bit of removal. And it kind of just, it's like such a shortcut in a way. But like I was mentioning earlier, it sort of grinds the paint into the fibers. You know, there's a little bit of texture. This is oil paper from Strathmore. I've also got some Arches oil paper. They make this stuff pre-impregnated with some kind of who knows what substance, and they've really done an interesting job in texturing it. It's just about finding what you feel like what you like to use. I would also suggest just normal watercolor paper. This is like a cold pressed? You can do a hot pressed paper if you like smooth paper, and then coat it either with a shellac, or traditionally one would use rabbit skin glue, or even acrylic gesso if that's what you are using. You can paint on paper, and I find particularly for studies, it's so nice to not have to lug around big canvases or panels if you're just experimenting. Like, I love painting on primed paper. You could do, 50 paintings and it only stacks up to about an inch. And it's really, doesn't overtake your entire life. Which, after 25 years of painting, I find I'm really grateful for that. So I'm kind of, every stroke or two that I make, I'm kind of scrubbing away, and then I'm dressing my brush. I'm like squeezing the paint out of it. Otherwise, it's just going to kind of mash paint around. But I'm really looking for the areas of highlights in my composition, anywhere I can bring a little more variety in. And that includes reflected lights. This isn't just our pure bright highlights. We're going to actually, step up and put some titanium white in the highlights to really see that contrast. But this is anywhere in my drawing that has a bit more light coming in. It's just kind of an easy way to get a lot of variety in the painting very quickly. And it's still going to be flat, but it's getting a lot more graphic and getting a lot more, hinting at where it wants to go. I think that is the goal of this stage, is just a hint of what's coming next. It kind of propels you forward in the painting in a way. It like makes you want to paint on it more, instead of, in a sense, like painting each square inch to completion. I'm kind of dealing with the entire painting as if it's, all coming up together. And
and that is sort of a tattooer thing, is this, a lot of people kind of, especially realists, will get into this thing where you're just completing small parts of it, and gradually it all stacks up into being a finished piece. But at no point are you addressing the whole composition at once. And so that only really works when you've really got the composition 100% worked out, and you're just nailing it down square inch by square inch.
Yeah, so this may provide some contrast in working methods, a different way to kind of assess the whole thing. And in a sense, it's kind of just making sure that, there's a lot of moving parts in a painting. There's a lot of different things happening, or can be, certainly. And kind of just, I guess the idea is not taking any of it too far right away. There's an axiom that one might, hold to, which states that we move from the general to the specific. Like at this point, if I put a really bright highlight in a certain area and I really render one spot fully, I may not quite, at least in the painting, I may not quite be understanding how it relates to the other parts yet. Particularly because there's so much transparency in the paint. It's sort of a whole other parameter. Whereas tattooing, like, yeah, with washes, you can get that to a degree, but with oil paint, you can really build up a lot of transparency. So it's kind of something that we get to play with. And you can build a whole lot of opacity. I mean, how cool it would be to do impasto tattoos. But like there's a sculptural aspect to oil painting in a way, sort of a micro relief sculpture that can happen.
There's been a few times I've done large work on people with serious scarring, and if you work with it artistically, you are doing an impasto tattoo.
Right. Oh, cool. So I'm kind of switching back and forth between using a paper towel for bigger areas, and maybe with a removal, I can even get a bit of texture in there and dab at things a bit more. And then in smaller areas, I'll go in with finer brushes. And this is just to give a hint of what's to come. Kind of like with layered painting, it's about, or I find it's about keeping myself really interested to keep going. And yeah, treating things really generally helps me see the whole composition at once.
And the idea of going general to specific is very, very opposite of how we think as tattooers.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that really struck Michelle and I, as we started thinking about tattooing from more of a fine art perspective, and vice versa, thinking about fine art from more of a tattooing perspective, that there's this gulf between styles of thinking. And in fact, I know plenty of really good painters who are also really good tattooers, but their painting style and their tattooing style are two completely different things. It's like they learned the piano and the oboe. There's almost no, like, the brushwork or whatever, the method of putting it down. They're using two different parts of their brain for it.
Exactly.
Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but I think that for me, the exciting part has been how many things from painting can I take directly into tattooing? How many things from tattooing can I bring directly into painting? And there's actually quite a lot of overlap.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously right now you wouldn't necessarily expect to remove, to lay in a glaze and then remove it in skin. So it's, there's different working methods, but I think principles can apply. And that's kind of what I'm getting at with a lot of this. Like, we're keeping our shadows somewhat transparent. There's not going to be a lot of detail in the shadows relative to the highlights. And that makes sense whether you're doing a drawing or a tattoo or a painting. Is that, and in life, when we look around the room, when something is well lit, we see a lot more detail in it. Something is in the shadows, we really tend not to see as much detail in it.
Well, I mean, we're simply not getting as much information. We're not getting as many photons, into our retina. And so it's sending fewer bits of information to our brain about that object.
Exactly. So, it's important to, at least for making a convincing illusion, should that be our goal, to sort of mimic nature in that way. Go, oh, right, well, I don't need to give as much information to the viewer on my painting about what's in the shadows. I should let it be a bit of a mystery. And it, paintings become a bit more lifelike in that way.
And also more compelling, because in real life, a shadow might be compelling because you might see hints, but you can't really see what's in there.
Right, sort of makes you
walk right up to it and pluck the thing out of the shadow to see it. And so if you can do that in a piece of art, you've transferred some of that mystery into the piece.
Exactly. Well,
So I'm probably getting a little ahead of the game here. I'm I
would expect no less, really, Guy. You know where you're going with this. I think you can kind of,
okay, so I'm trying not to, okay, well, here's what I'm doing. I'm sticking to 2 colors, which is just, I've got a little Payne's gray and a little raw sienna.
Nice.
And I'm lifting things out, and you can even see some paper towel textures in here, which I might allow some of that to come all the way through to the finished piece.
Yeah.
But even with just these 2 pigments and without any titanium white, which I don't think I'm going to add any today, this is already going to have some range to it, some warm and cool range.
Definitely. I think I'm getting close to a place where I can sort of pivot into showing what the stark difference is of adding some white on top of this. I've got, more or less my composition is shaking itself out. There's starting to be a little definition. I don't have any dark shadows. I've completely held off on that for the moment, but I can start to see there's at least a value map going on. I'm bringing some of the lights back in, and everything is completely still in this warm spectrum. And you could really take this this method of removing that imprimatura as far as you wanted to, as long as the paint stays wet and you can keep removing with it. And sometimes you may want to dip into a solvent, be it mineral spirits or turpentine, and that would ostensibly remove even more of that paint, but also presents another complexity where you have some more liquid flowing around. But let me see if I just dipped into a little bit of mineral spirits, or terps in this case. I tend to like turpentine over mineral spirits, it's personal preference. But
okay, so what is the difference?
So mineral spirits is a petroleum distillate, and turpentine is the essential oil of pine sap. So the way that works in practice is that if we're using resins like damar, like in varnishes, which sometimes we'll add to our painting mediums, mineral spirits won't actually fully dissolve those free resins. And I learned this the hard way after destroying so many brushes for so many years, and just could not figure out why I couldn't get them cleaned. I was even using terpenoid, which sounds like turpentine, but is mineral spirits under a brand name. And it would just not fully remove the resins. I think we can see there's a little bit of, extra really blingy highlights going on now. So I'm using a turpentine, a little bit of solvent on the brush, and scrubbing away at it a little more for the places where I have a brighter highlight.
That's bringing it back down almost to the white.
Pretty close, but I'm sure it would never get completely clean again. So it's still going to be a little bit warm. And it's, I could probably, depending on how fast your oil is drying, you can play with this probably even for a couple of days if you were really wanting to get extremely meticulous about it. If you just use turpentine, if you just use a solvent with your paint, it would probably dry much quicker. It'll definitely dry much quicker. And you may not have as much working time, but that's just something that
I'm using liquid for this, so that's probably going to give me no more than a couple, 3 hours.
Yeah, going to dry quickly. And that, that's like, to taste, to personal taste, like how quickly do you want your paint to dry? That's such a huge part of oil painting that, I find so many people when they talk to me about oils, they're like, oh, it just takes so long to dry. Like, well, it doesn't have to. It does, compared to maybe acrylic, sure. But there's so many things we can do to the paint to get it to behave how we want to.
Yeah, and plus the other thing is just to lock onto the idea that that longer drying time is a good thing, and that you want to leverage that to your advantage and not let it be a problem.
Yeah, it certainly can be. I just say work on way more paintings. You know, if something takes a long time to dry and you're like, oh, I just want to keep working on it, well, just do way more paintings. And this kind of technique is really useful for doing just that. I mean, look how quickly we've got value over this entire piece, and how quickly the, you know, this monochrome, basically a drawing in paint, is coming to life very quickly. I could do a handful of these in a day. If I get done with this one and it's not dry, you know, it'd be very easy to start a few more and quickly have a whole series of paintings emerging.
Oh, wow. Cool.
So,
Okay. Guys, dragon paint, very nice. That's beautiful. You did a really good job. I'm shocked. Nice perspective. How you did the underbelly. Very good. You gonna do another one? Great. Do another one. What's stopping you?
Okay, you want to try the wipeout technique on
Yeah,
something?
do wipeout. Do wipeout. Kyle, let's see you.
Okay.
Okay. So just do a rough sketch of a simple object on here.
I gotta get my small stuff.
Okay, good call. This is a real test of how good of a teacher are you. So we're gonna put a 10-year-old in front of you. I mean, she's got a lot of paint skills already.
I know it. She's
Yeah,
masterful. She's masterful. I want to see where her career is going.
Yeah, right now we're well, we've been working on a book together for 4 or 5 years, and right now we're kind of in crunch time getting the illustrations finished. It's pretty exciting.
Awesome. That was really
Okay,
exciting.
so Kai, just figure out some. Okay, figure out a. Oh, you're gonna paint a brush. Are you sure? That's a weird shape for that. You'll have to zoom in on part of it.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay,
I always have a brush and coffee.
I think you should pick a different object
Oh,
because.
what is this?
Okay, you got it.
It was exciting seeing you guys do the still lifes and watching Kaya's, her paintings were just so impressive day after day. It was really, really cool.
I just couldn't. I couldn't personally keep up with it. I did 20 days, but I had other stuff going on, and even just to do the, you know, Michelle and Kaya to get through it every night. I mean, we had to really push, and it's kind of interesting because,
Like 2 in the morning every
you know, imagine how your average 10-year-old is. You know, they're wanting to watch cartoons before bed, but she'd be like, I need to, oh yeah, she was still 9. I need to get started on my painting now or it's not gonna be done before bedtime. You know, she's like watching the clock, planning her evening out.
True artist. So I think you can more or less see, I mean, even in the tiny thumbnail on my screen, I'm kind of looking at to see how my value scale is working out. You can start to see I'm getting as much contrast as possible with this extremely, you know, extremely limited palette.
So is there any way you could, is it too wet to pick up or can you show that closer to the camera?
Yeah, I can definitely come closer. I had it just stuck onto here, but.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So, you know, it's still graphic, it's still a drawing with outlines, but now it's like that, the mortar and pestle is starting to gain a little bit more volume.
Yeah, so you're really doing your wipeout like at a small, like paintbrush kind of scale.
Yeah, I'm kind of going for, I'm wiping the bigger areas. You can kind of see those background, the drapery.
Yeah.
I've done those and wiped out, but then I'm just allowing myself to come in as detailed as I want to be and you know, jump into those little details. I could get even smaller and smaller brushes. I'm using like maybe a 1/4 inch filbert right now, sort of, or maybe it's just a flat, just like a 1/4 inch flat brush. But I could certainly come in with a little, you know, tiny little round and find some even smaller areas. And this is a stiff brush that I've mistreated.
So basically just stiff old brushes are perfect for this.
Sometimes, I mean, I'm just kind of experimenting and seeing which ones lift off better. I definitely have a whole lot of brushes that I have abused laying around or that didn't get washed, and then they're stiff. I try to hesitate from throwing those away prematurely.
Oh, they're so useful. I never throw them away until there's nothing left on the end of them. Then they stop being useful.
Right? Like it's a nice little scrubby brush right now, and
A scumbler.
Scumbler. I think it's useful to have brushes you can beat up, and then yeah, it's useful to have really quality tools as well, but to know the difference in a way. Like I simultaneously love having really, really, the nicest brushes I can really justify affording, and the completely bottom shelf tools that you'd be surprised sometimes work just as well, if not better, than something you spent a whole bunch of money on.
For
I have a brush for certain things. Yeah, certainly. I have a brush that was kind of like so expensive that I've never used it. It was just like, oh God, I'm going to ruin this in one shot if I'm glazing with resins and using all kinds of sticky mediums, which I tend to do a lot of. Just kind of feel like it's going to be a single-use brush because the hairs are so fine and delicate. It's like you really have to be diligent with taking care of the quality materials.
Ever since I started using liquid, I no longer could allow myself to be sloppy about it. I couldn't just say, I'll just wrap them in saran wrap till tomorrow morning. It's like, no, your brushes will be dead if you do that.
Yep, that's all you get. Definitely. There's certain methods that people will use. Not if you're using liquid, but if you're just using
on and use wiping to pull it back up.
If you're just using linseed oil, people will soak their brushes in safflower or sunflower oil, but oil that doesn't dry, and then it will just keep your brush sort of conditioned until you come back to it.
Grab something from your nature.
All right.
And sometimes I have a bad habit of forcing myself to do everything with this big brush because I just want the brush work to look consistent. Once I start with it, I'm afraid to get away from it.
Yeah, exactly. All too often, I'm just like one brush wonder. Like, oh wait, I can actually mix this up for different purposes. It's nice to be able to at least just have a few options. I mean, it'd be like doing a tattoo with only one needle. Sometimes that works, but sometimes you kind of like it's really worth just switching to a size that makes it useful for the area you're on. It just depends on the piece.
And okay, you've been away from tattooing, and so now we've got cartridges, and you can just like, I think I'll use 11 different needle groups this session, and it will take me 10 seconds to switch.
So great, so great. Such a fun time to come back to tattooing now. So I'm basically going to pivot into just at least making a few marks with the titanium white to try to show the difference. I've basically got, a start. There's more I can do, and there's more I will do with removing the brown for these more subtle shadows. It only gets so bright, compared to this blob of titanium white on my palette.
Right. Yeah. Looking at it in the camera, it's very different.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm gonna make sure my brush is as clean as I can get all the brown out of there. If I'm gonna use one that I've just used. And I'm probably not gonna really use any medium right now because I'm just interested in full contrast. So I'm looking for the brighter areas of my painting where I could drop a few highlights in. I'll hold this up to the screen closer once I get a few swatches of paint down here. But immediately what I notice as I lay a bit of this titanium white down, it's not the same temperature at all as the lights that I was removing. It's far cooler.
Yeah, I can see even just the tiny image in the thumbnail. Yeah, there's this visible blue. And I know that's an illusion. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, because everything is so warm, if we put a, something that's neutral in there, of course, it's going to have no choice but to look cooler. And that's just some of the optics that we can play with, and some of what we're looking at in the slideshow of how it seems like there's a bigger range of color than there actually is. And we can do more with a bit less. So I'll just put a few more of these highlights around. We don't need to belabor this too long, but it's just to give the sense of what this process is, and what we want to have done before part 2 in a couple of weeks would be doing your imprimatura, wiping out some more of these subtle highlights, some more of these, the softer lights to start to develop volume. And then when we're going toward our brighter, more crisp lights, use a bit of titanium white. And again, I'm not using any medium. There's already medium on the painting. I don't need to make it more saucy probably than it already is. And I'm just kind of picking out the brightest brights and allowing that white to, it will blend into the brown a bit. I want it to stand out and be nice and poppy and cool, but I can also finesse it and kind of blend it into the browns of the background. And that's what starts to develop this middle ground. We're not only doing warm shadows versus cool highlights and nothing in the middle. They have to converge somewhere. So that's where we get translucent halftones. So it's sort of that bridge, transparent shadows, opaque highlights, and those are met in the middle by translucent halftones naturally. Sort of, it occurs by itself, but like we don't have to try too hard to make it happen, but it is nice to be able to notice what's going on. So in a way, I'm kind of creating not only the values, but a volume map. I'm trying to create that three-dimensional illusion as much as we can.
Let me see the outline of it. It's going to disappear, because you're going to cover your whole canvas with this brown sauce. Kai is about to do a wipeout.
Right.
Painting.
I already finished my other painting, the dragon, which I hope I don't completely mud it out. I'm used to acrylic. Right now I'm doing oils, and I really hope I don't make it funny.
Well, it's a class, so it's okay. That's the beauty about.
Well, I think I might give away my paintings to my friends. So
But only if you're happy with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to give something away to my friends that I wasn't happy with, and so I already know that I'm gonna give away the dragon one I did, and I think I'm gonna give this painting I'm doing to another friend, only if it turns out though.
Okay. Well, the one thing I would say is you really need to fill your canvas more. But everyone who takes my classes knows that I'm always on their case about making their shapes bigger.
And this is not your class.
No, it's not. Yeah, she sure told me.
Yeah. Absolutely.
All right. So yeah, I might come in here just for fun since you're doing it and add a little bit of that titanium. I've been avoiding it so far.
Yeah, it's good to have restraint, I think, as much as possible. And then finally, when I can't handle it anymore, and I'm just like, I cannot deal with whatever process I'm doing any longer, then finally, it's like such a relief to sort of like the cresting wave, just the wave breaks, and it's like, oh, now I'm getting these interesting effects from the white coming in and sort of blending across, and suddenly there's, I'm taking it from being a really graphic kind of flat thing to suddenly it's getting a lot more dimension. Slowly, but there's a lot more information happening to the point where you start to see colors that aren't there. I mean, I can almost pick up on like some lavender, almost pick up on some kind of pale violets that come in. You really get your eye really starts to fill in the color. And this is maybe what Dali is talking about, the secret of the colorist. It's like kind of let the eye do the work for you.
Do you have anything for me to rinse the liquid off my hand?
Yeah, just get a paper towel.
So there's always this fine when adding whites, whether we're removing or whether we're adding, it's sort of that dance between softer diffuse lights and then really blingy highlights, kind of playing between the two.
Yeah, what I'm doing now is I'm just sort of buffing some of these wipeout areas that I did with a smaller brush. I finally let myself go to a smaller brush and just trying to remove any slop.
Yeah, work those transitions.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, the oil paint's so forgiving. I mean, you can kind of generally get it there and then come in and finesse the edges, feather the edges a bit. And
That's my drawing.
Okay.
I can do it though.
The idea, Kai, is you weren't supposed to wipe everything off, but just wipe out where you wanted the highlights. Let's see. It's okay. Oh, well, I was trying to explain it. But, hey, Kai, it's okay. I'm not on your case. I was just telling you how to do it.
Sorry, I keep getting it all over me.
How about if you go wash up and be done? Hey, Kai. Yep.
I want these on. I hate this.
All right. But yeah, I still want to get to those titanium highlights.
yeah, it's so gratifying, honestly. It's like, wow. And it brings in it starts to bring in the full temperature range. That makes it, it starts to mimic light. It's like, oh, the highlight is cool and the shadows are warm. And now I've got basically within this this kind of very straightforward process, we've got the value, temperature, and transparency all in place, which sets the stage for, the overpainting, to where we can just map our colors to this foundation that we've created.
Sure. Get to put the cherry on top. All right, now I'm going to add that titanium and see what happens.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep it real simple and just a couple of them.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be over the top.
I know how I am. I know how I am. I have to stop myself when I'm tattooing from running white highlights through the whole thing. In fact, I've kind of gotten into a habit of making sure I've got a couple of highlight colors. Some lighter pastels that aren't quite white.
Yeah.
And doing a lot of it with that so that I just don't overdo it, so that the white continues to be an exception and not too widespread.
Exactly. Fortunately for this process, knowing that we're going to paint over it, knowing there will be color that comes on top of this, I think we can not have to think of this as the final look, and it can actually be, we can place the white in a few more areas. Think of it more like building the sculpture rather than rendering the look of the final piece, because we're going to come in and glaze over these anyway. So the white will get knocked back down and we'll have to build it back up at least one more time, if not many times throughout the course of a painting, in order to, not only build the solidity of the volume, but to get that highlight back there. So, I think it is all right to unleash on it a little bit more, and not think of this as the final step at all. And yeah, we can, in general, push the lights a little bit farther than they might ultimately end up at the end of the painting. I might kind of wrap up what I'm doing. I'll show this a little bit closer. And I'll keep working on this throughout the next, many days or week. But the idea is how quickly you can kind of get a composition to hang together. The drapery in the background sort of, I've wiped it out, but I haven't put any actual bright highlights with the titanium white. I've only put the titanium on these kind of very much more solid objects, the shiny eyelet segments, and things that I really wanted to be solid and have volume in contrast to the the areas that I want to fall away. So this is, you could take this a bit further, certainly, and I will, but I'm not even going to put my shadows in yet. I'm completely resisting temptation to drop shadows in at this stage, though it's clearly kind of what's coming next. So that's pretty much where I'm going to leave this one for now. And
Right.
Whenever you're kind of getting through it, we could transition to the next exercise. I'm just keeping an eye on time a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it. I think it's time to do that if we're going to do a whole other exercise.
Yeah, I think the basics are there, and I can certainly take some questions about it, and whether now or later on the app too.
Yeah, I need to go talk to Daughter for a moment. You want to do this breakout thing? I think you should do that because.
Yeah, in the life of the artist. Relate.
Is this now we're going to be moving on to that second little color palette here?
Yeah, we're gonna switch over at least conceptually, and and make sure we get a look at the sort of gray, the grisaille underpainting, and a way to approach that.
Cool.
Sort of
Yeah,
a different,
going this way. I've never done an underpainting before. I've just only started getting into oils and painting in general, like this year when we were doing the tattoo gatherings, and so I'd never done an underpainting. I was always just kind of thrown into these projects that we were doing, and it looks cool. I like it.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to just treat the entire composition rather quickly. And when we're moving from general concepts towards specific, we can treat things much more broadly and kind of more quickly.
Yeah.
So broad strokes, and then moving toward detail. This next way of painting might be slightly different. We're kind of rendering maybe in a way that makes more sense for tattooing. We're kind of dealing with each area.
Mm-hmm.
So there's still some parameters that will be somewhat different, of course.
You gonna do the same one again?
Or no?
Oh, sorry.
Awesome. Is it probably like a relatively good time to let people have the link to zoom in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So if anybody's in the comments here, I'm about to put in the link for the Zoom, so you can kind of show off what you're doing as well. And if you wanted to ask any real-time questions, then you can. Where is it? Oh. Oops. There we go. Yeah, I think everybody's been pretty caught up with doing their paintings. There's people watching, but not as many people in the comments. And sometimes that happens when we're moving along. It's like, oh, just in the zone of painting. So
that's perfect. That's
Okay.
perfect.
Sorry, I had to step away for a second there. All right.
No worries.
Yeah, David, I just wanted to show you where mine was at.
Yeah.
I did go ahead and add a few shadows.
Yeah.
Uh,
Nice.
But yeah, real simple. You know, if you look up close, you can see the little bit of actual white that I added, but mostly this is just wiping out. But you can also see, you know, there's plenty of paper towel texture in there and that sort of thing. And I always invite that stuff. I welcome it into my paintings because, again, just like with the so many other things about painting compared to tattooing, it's so refreshing to be able to relinquish that control and you know, let some things just happen on their own. Let that alchemy take place.
Absolutely. I think we can be responsive to it in really fun ways too. I mean, the point is that this is a contrast to tattooing, and there's an experimentation really available to us. And, you know, there's all kinds of techniques to really just give yourself texture in the background. You know, you can smash things up on your painting and really work the textures for all they're worth. I mean, painters have made their whole career on that.
I've known a few painters. I've met two of them actually, Chris Dingwell being one of them. This other guy, I wish I could remember his name. I met in Michigan many years ago. Michelle and I met this guy at a friend's house, but he would sometimes take his paintings out in the street and set them on fire. And I know Dingwell has done stuff with blowtorches, and then of course you go back in and fix it, and you know, do what it takes to bring it to the look that you want. But yeah, that's the moral of the story is there's lots of ways to get textures and effects.
Exactly. Bringing that chaos in is really, you know, I always used to think if I just messed up a painting at the beginning, then I could spend all this time sort of finessing it and fixing it, rather than trying to be so precious about it from the beginning. You know, it kind of inevitably messes itself up. So, you know, sometimes we want to invite a little bit of controlled chaos in, or uncontrolled even. But there's something powerful in that.
Oh, really? I think making art in any medium is really a process of making and fixing mistakes over and over again until it starts to look like something.
Exactly. So perhaps I'll just start with a bit of the color mixing that I want to do for this next exercise, just so we can jump on it wherever people are at in their process. I can just kind of explain what I'm doing, and there's no one way to play with this, but this would be a grayscale underpainting, as we were looking at a few of those examples earlier.
Okay.
You know, some people might just want to use black and white. That's totally legitimate. And you have your whole value range within black and white. We saw in one of the demos earlier of the skull on the book that I used ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, and that created a nice mid-ground neutral sort of black. Chromatic black is what we would call it. And then from there, I could mix that with white and have a whole grayscale that had a little more life to it. Mixed blacks are often a little bit more lively, got a bit more energy to them, a bit more pop. And, you know, we can push them cooler or warmer, depending on how we observe the light source. You know, right now, I've got this silver pitcher sitting off screen over here, but the light from outside is hitting it. It's definitely a cool light for my highlight.
Need the right
Play with
color.
that. So basically what I'm going to do, I've got my...
It's not meant to be the right color. It's getting kind of a value range.
Got my Indian yellow and my red, alizarin crimson. So blue, yellow, and red. What I want to do is mix their opposite color from the other two. Like if I want to find the opposite of blue, because I'm trying to mix a black in the middle, I want to mix an orange opposite the blue. So I can use my other two primaries, the red and the yellow, to mix an orange. And then I'll start mixing that blue and the orange together to see if I can neutralize that at some kind of a chromatic black. Same with the yellow. I want to find its opposite and put it across from it. So that would be a violet. I'll mix the blue and the red together to make a violet. Then I'll start mixing those together to find a chromatic neutral in the middle. Same thing goes for the red. I'll mix the blue and the yellow together to make a green, and then mix those together. And basically what I should find, if I was really doing you know, precise mixtures, is that the central color, that neutral, would be pretty much the same in all three of these lines of color, because it's the same mixtures. Alternatively, if I wanted to go just straight for the jugular, I could just mix the red, the yellow, and the blue in a big dark pile and see what it turned into. And it will, like these three make a really lovely chromatic black. I mean, they will just neutralize to the deepest, darkest black. Darker than a lot of black paints do, because there's so much transparency in these that they're not only making a neutral color, but they're capturing a lot of light due to their transparency. So there's not only the value, but there's the transparency factor. So I'll just make some mixtures. And I like doing this all with of course, a palette knife on your palette, but even when I'm going to make some of these other subtle mixtures, I'm going to pull some of them out to white. I don't like to use a brush because you have to spend so much time washing a brush in order to clean it out, and it will always be stained. So I try to do as much of the color swatch mixtures as I can, just with a palette knife. And I just cannot recommend enough. We'll do some more of these in part 2, but cannot recommend doing color mixing, like making yourself charts, color mixing charts. It's such an educational process to see what these colors do when you mix them together. You think we know what they're going to do. It makes sense, but actually seeing it is so different. And I would do versions where I mix, 3 different blues with 3 different browns and try every iteration and really see what happens. You might find you find combinations that you just love and other combinations that you cannot stand. And it's just really useful to know that. Got a violet from the blue and the red mixed opposite the Indian yellow. Got the green that I'm mixing up opposite the red. But each of these will give a slightly different range. I mean, now we've got 3 different complementary scenarios we're playing out.
I don't have it. I can't see. Sorry.
Essentially, I'm mixing a pile right in the middle. I'm taking this violet and this yellow and mixing a pile right in the middle. And then I'll take a portion of that, move it over, and mix that with more of that original yellow. I'm giving myself a gradient of different piles of paint. I can start to see the range of color that's possible with just 3 colors with this limited palette. I know they're pretty dark, probably on the screen, very dark, hard to see. I'm going to mix white with these and it will make it a lot easier to see what's happening. I take that middle mixture, that neutral, and mix it half and half with that violet. And you can do these in a lot more piles than this. I'm just doing 5. Got our initial 2 mixed in the middle for the third, and then
No, painting.
or teach that to work. Same thing with the red and the green, mixing half and half in the middle. Depending on the mixtures, these will have a lot of different personality than each other, and it's kind of something interesting to play with. Mixing half of that towards the red. That central neutral pile again, mixing with the mixed green. In a way, we're just seeing what our colors are capable of, how they behave in combination, and then we can adjust from there to make them do what we want. And one more of these with the blue, orange. And kind of what I'm trying to do with this is take these really bright colors and figure out how to neutralize them. These are colors that I would definitely consider using for an overpainting, for glazing, and for finishing work. But if I can make them work for me for an underpainting as well, that creates a lot of versatility. Doing more with less. All right. So I've got now 15 piles of paint, essentially, starting from these first 3. And what I'd like to do is pull a little bit of the titanium white with my palette knife, and I kind of lay it down beneath one of the colors and start to sort of mash it up into the color that I mixed, and then pull it back down. And I kind of make a gradient and see what those mixtures are doing. They're very hard to see what the color is doing when these transparent colors are mixed together. They're so dark. It's very difficult to actually ascertain.
You should put your brush down when you're doing that. Your problem.
So David, I'm
Yes.
just about to start on that part. I was just finishing off my other little underpainting. We're doing 2 more exercises, is that correct?
We'll just do this. I mean, one, we can just do the color mixing on a palette.
Yep.
Then we'll just do this one.
Oh, okay, cool. And then I've got like a little wooden palette. Is there anything that I should have done to that beforehand? Panel, sorry, a wooden panel.
Often we'll oil those palettes. It depends. If it's kind of thirsty and it wants to drink in the paint, it can be really good to oil them with linseed oil first.
Okay, I'm sure it's thirsty. It's from the dollar store, so they seem to be thirsty things.
Yeah, usually they will be. Yeah, treating it with linseed oil, often many coats even will be good to kind of give it a gloss. That way it doesn't just drink in all the paint that you put on there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't bring linseed oil down to the studio, so I may have to just have a thirsty panel.
Yeah, it's something you would do perhaps like in advance and let it fully dry. I mean, no worries. You can once you do your paint mixtures and clean your palette, just afterwards oil it and let it sit until it dries. Maybe even a couple coats. Just kind of, you could rub it in with your hands even.
Okay, cool.
And the reason I say that is, there's that whole spontaneous combustion thing of linseed oil soaked rags. So that's always
always good to know.
You think to watch out for. And I think that's like linseed oil soaked rags. Like if you're, there's a little bit of oil on a paper towel, it's probably not going to spontaneously combust. Never had it happen. I kind of want to experiment with it and see how much it takes to actually get it to happen.
David, I've had that happen to me a couple of times.
Really?
Oh, there you
And
go.
I'll tell you how it happened is it was cheap linseed oil. And this happened a couple of times. And each time I thought, maybe I'd been careless and a spark from something else got in my garbage can. But then, I took extra care and knew that nothing like that was happening. But what was happening is it was a can with a lid. And I would wipe down the canvas with oil and drop the rag in the can and shut the lid and leave, because at the time Michelle and I had these 2 loft spaces on 2 different floors of the same building. I'd go upstairs and make a cup of coffee or something and come back down and there's smoke coming out of the trash can.
Wow.
Happened twice. Yeah, scary.
Oh my gosh.
It is better to have those cans with the lid. At least it does, limit flow of oxygen and should ostensibly keep your house from burning down. But wow.
Good reason to get good quality linseed oil, I guess.
Yeah, and disposing
Yeah,
of
this
that.
is like hardware store linseed oil, and yeah, I would never do that.
Often I'll like soak the rags in water if you have paper towels, just kind of like or lay them out flat to dry is another strategy I've seen people do to like not allow them to be crumpled up and gaining heat, because the oil is oxidizing. It doesn't dry like water evaporates. It actually pulls in oxygen and generates heat. So that's where this combustion happens. So I'm mixing white up into each of these colors. And what it's showing me is just this complete range. It's helping me see how the colors can neutralize a bit, going from just pure red, yellow, blue into kind of a whole language of
It's super
slightly
muddy.
more subtle colors.
So muddy.
I need to do a wipeout painting with you later on when we're not
I
distracted.
want to do it.
Hey, Ty, you need instruction to do it, and I can't give you instruction. It's not possible. However, I think you'll like the wipeout method, and I will show you a time when I'm not distracted. Okay, I'm gonna paint a vertebra. Okay, so let's keep going. You've got it looks like a whole spectrum there, but you're really just going to be doing a gray painting here, right?
Well, I think this is where it can be a
gray
little bit more,
underpainting.
I think this is where it can get a little more interesting. I would say that each of these gradients has the option to be considered a kind of gray. It is a full spectrum, and maybe I'll just mix one kind of pile of these three primaries together off to the side. But what I'm getting at with the underpainting is it doesn't have to be black and white equals gray. It's more just that we're neutralizing our colors a bit. There can still be quite a bit of color information, and this gives us a lot of variation in temperature. I might be able to, between this violet and the yellow, I might be able to find something that resembles whatever the most neutral color I can find out of there. Happens to be this one closer to the violet, that is approximating more of a gray. But in certain areas, I could open it up and let it be a bit warmer, or I could make it a bit cooler. So it's sort of like adding a bit of complexity to the game now, not just black and white equals gray, but this whole range of chromatic neutrals. And in a way, it's taking what we were saying, these really bright colors that are just sort of on the equator of the color sphere, of the color planet, and developing essentially an entire sort of language of other colors that emerges from them and gives us a lot of options. So I'm not too worried about it being like black and white equals gray underpainting, though that is definitely something that could be played with as well. But a mix something that gets a bit
So
more
with this one, are we going to be applying with brushes the traditional way? Are we going to be using some wipeout here, or what's
no, this would be just like going right for the painting. This is a bit more kind of like going for what the full effect of the painting would be, but remembering that when we saw those two, the reclining nude, basically one was in grayscale and one was in color. The dark shadow, the shadows, the darkest parts were still reserved a little bit. They were a bit lighter gray than what we ultimately wanted to do.
right? So we're not going all the way to 100 on the value scale.
Right. I would say the lights can be fully bright, but reserve, like the darks, I would reserve, to maybe half to 2/3 their full strength, because we'll come back in the overpainting and glaze on top of them. If they're already fully dark, nothing will really happen when we glaze over them. But if they have a little bit of luminosity left in it, then we glaze over it and get kind of a really rich effect out of it. But yeah, not full power value scale just yet. Keep it on the high side. Keep it on the high key, basically. More toward the light. I'm just mixing up kind of a general neutral out of these three primaries. And there's so many different ways to mix a neutral or mix a black. When I first got my oil paints at age 15, it said, here, mix these 5 different colors and that'll give you a black. I can't remember what they were at this point at all, but like a violet, a transparent yellow, red, a brown, and a green perhaps, and they kind of made a really deep dark black. It's like, wow, okay, that was sort of lesson number one. I'm just sort of mixing this to taste in a way. There's really so many options. You can do whatever fits your style, but the idea is that an underpainting would be somewhat more neutral than the overpainting that comes later. It doesn't have to be dead, though. That is one way that the underpainting is talked about, as if it's dead color. Like a corpse, you know, this is kind of you want to breathe life into it later.
Right. Okay. So basically you're leaving the life bringing process to that final, you know, adding the personal touches, the actual painting of it.
Exactly. This is the drawing.
10 to 50.
You know, it's like a drawing in paint.
I think that's another thing. Yeah, that's another thing. I think people hear the term oil sketch and are like, okay, what exactly do you mean by that?
Right.
I think mostly when we see a painting, we think that there's a painting.
Right.
But then you hear people use terms like that.
Yeah, I mean, so many different ways that could be interpreted too. One is just that you don't take a super long time on that, but maybe you just, an oil sketch would be something where you get the general sense of where you'd like to see it go. I mean, you look at like, for instance, Gustave Moreau, his museum in Paris, and there's, you know, he's got these masterful finished sort of classically rendered paintings, and then next to them you'll see a watercolor sketch that's just so abstracted, where he's just working out the color palette. And you know, they're really like very modern works in a sense. So you can see on top there I have much more of what you could see as grays. Here we've got really a lot of chroma.
Right.
A lot of powerful color, which could be nice for little accents in the underpainting. Maybe I want to reflect a little, you know, a little red from the fabric, or maybe I want to hint at some of the color that's coming next. And I can have a whole language of colors to do that, none of which are going to be eye-poppingly chromatic as compared to the original primaries. But here on the top, I've mixed basically what I'm calling a chromatic black, a chromatic neutral. It has life to it. It doesn't look like ivory black by a long stretch. You know, it's got personality for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So this range here, but I'm going to use that for my base tones of chromatic blacks, and then I can kind of pull into these, you know, more of the center lines, more whatever I'm finding to be pretty neutral in here, and it really looks like can look like a very colorful painting while being pretty reserved still when you compare it to the brilliant note that comes later. So it may be useful to have a little bit of medium at hand. Again, I've got my 1-to-1 linseed oil to turpentine. I'm trying to not use a ton of medium if I don't need to. I really think it's better to be reserved about it rather than overdo it.
And what's the main reason for that?
I think things can just slide around a whole lot. I find that whole chasing mud around
Let it dry.
happens much more if I've got wet paint. If I've got really wet paint, I'm kind of just, it's sliding around, particularly if you've got a really smooth surface. The paper or
yeah, that's been an issue for us lately. Like when we were doing those still lifes, we were playing around with different panel types, and we definitely found that some of the store-bought panels we had to then put a texture coat of gesso onto them ourselves because they just were way too smooth.
Yeah, it gets so slippery. You know, it's just something that gets honed in over time. I think when we find our ultimate ideal surface and our ultimate mixture, I've always, you know, you think, oh, oil paint and the mediums, I'm going to use all this medium, and it's so easy to use too much. And I would initially just dip into the paint. It's already got oil in it, and just see how that treats us. The paint, and you know, one thing I'll mention is the whole fat over lean concept, and it's so mystifying for the longest time for me. What the hell does that mean? And what I really get is that you want your your earlier layers have less oil in them, and your later layers have more oil in them.
Once it dries, it might be finished, but I can't tell.
So you really don't want to put too much oil in the first layer. And it relates to paint cracking and flexibility and
I think I'm going.
longevity of the paint film over time. Adhesion. If you get too much oil, paint won't stick at a certain point. It just kind of beads up and runs off.
Right, and also you'll find that your brush is just lifting it back off again and you know, exposing the panel.
Yes, really one of those less is more. Like I'll try just to use the paint as it is, as sort of dry as I can. And if I need it, if I need the medium to push it around, to smooth it out, then I'll go for it. So as I'm doing this grisaille tech, you know, as I'm coming into painting with these grays, I usually start with the shadow side of the spectrum. And hold this up. You can see my shadows are not particularly black. It's a little bit hard to see in this light, but they're not super.
Yeah, but I can tell that's about 60-70%.
About like that. Yeah, I would say about 2/3 of where it will go. And I will definitely plan to glaze over that with a darker color in the overpainting to give that depth of shadow. But at first I'll pretty much be blocking in the shadows around the whole piece pretty consistently and try to get it to really hold together as one composition without too many disparate values flying around. So I can kind of keep picking up out of one or two piles of paint and just try to be very consistent with how I'm applying it. You know, consider this a block-in. It's sort of, again, general to specific still applies here. I might be scrubbing the paint a little bit. I've got there's a little bit of tooth on this Arches paper. I think they formulated it for like alla prima painting, so you could really kind of get those impasto strokes on there if you want. It's a little bit harder to get a nice glaze to go across. There's this micro texture they've clearly engineered to fit certain kinds of painting.
So David, if anybody's just catching up, would you be able to go over a real quick thing of which colors you use to mix each of those colors on your palette?
Yeah, absolutely. I just started with the primary triad that we're seeing on this edge. I've got an ultramarine blue, Indian yellow, and an alizarin crimson, all of which are pretty transparent colors. And to make a chromatic black, which I'm calling this mixture up here, this dark mixture, it's essential that we have transparent colors. And this is just something you can read about it and research it, which colors are transparent or semi-transparent or opaque. But if I mixed an opaque yellow, say like a cadmium yellow, something really bright, this would kind of neutralize as more of a muddy gray or a brownish color instead of going towards this really deep, dark neutral. So Indian yellow is a nice transparent yellow, and you can see in its body color, it looks more like orangey brown. Mm-hmm. Only when I mix it with white does it kind of show how bright it gets. Alizarin crimsons are really, kind of a cold red, but really deep. And these aren't the only colors you can work with. Certainly you could switch that for a Prussian blue, would be a really dark blue, or a phthalo blue, like more of that kind of blue-green. There's a lot of modern reds, Arlene red, and there's a lot of different transparent colors that we could do this with, but this just happens to be well, first, it's non-toxic. These are colors that won't harm you in any way, and we're using titanium white for the white mixtures. And what I'm doing with the white is just helping to see the personality of each of these color swatches that I've mixed. It's really just difficult to see them when they're all in their body color because they're so dark. I'm using a gray palette, which kind of darkens them as well. I like that.
Is there a reason for the gray palette?
Well, one is this is a disposable palette, which can be really nice when if you're traveling a lot or on the road or different things like that. But also, I find if I'm using a white palette, for instance, I tend to mix my colors too bright. So this is a 50% gray, and it's been formulated so that you can kind of gauge your light mixtures and your dark mixtures equally off of the gray. And you can kind of understand the value range a little bit better. I know people who use a mirror for their palette as well, and it's reflecting all the colors of your environment, the ceiling particularly, or other colors bouncing around your room that might help to sort of key your values in a little more. But I notice, yeah, if I'm using a white palette, I tend to think that I need to mix things brighter than I do. Things look really, looks like a halftone, looks like a 50% halftone on the white, and then you get it to your painting and it just looks like a pastel. Looks too bright. So this is kind of a way, it's just the absolute neutral. This is from Richardson. Let me hold up the front of it. You can see called Gray Matters. They have the whole series of palettes, and they also make brushes that are 50% gray that have a non-reflective metal ferrule on it. So you don't get your plein air painting, you don't get blinded by the reflection of the sun off of your brush, that metal ferrule on your brush. They've kind of thought of a lot of things for us that way. In any event, this is perhaps a bit more of a straightforward process now, this kind of gray underpainting. It's like I'm basically just kind of coloring, you could say color by number, but it's more just treating it like a gray drawing by number. I'm not really, where there's not a magical wipeout technique happening. This is sort of just like fill it in. This is the dead layer of a painting, and then we'll come over and in part 2 of this course in a couple weeks and push and pull, glaze the shadows back really deep, and then we'll start to pull the highlights back forward again. It's sort of this dance of, 1 step backwards, 2 steps forward, and seeing how much sort of light effect we can gain by doing that.
So what's the advantage of going back and forth like that, especially if you already have a sense of where you want it to end up? What do you gain?
What I find is that there's a complexity that we see in nature. And it's not to say this can't be gotten in other ways, but there's a complexity that we're mimicking in nature, the way that the shadows actually become really deep and transparent, the way the halftones pull out of those as if pulling out of coming out of a fog and emerging into these optical translucencies as they sort of make their crescendo into opaque highlights. So in a way, it's really mimicking the way that light plays off of objects, where the painting isn't just a flat picture, but actually invites you into the depths of the shadows. You get these sort of, you can get indescribably subtle neutral colors that perhaps you're seeing 2 complementary colors occupying the same space. It's kind of like, what color is that? It can be very difficult to identify. And I think that we get a lot of that in nature. And it's just looking at a strategy in paint to be able to wrap ourselves around the complexity of nature without doing our heads in,
Okay, so basically by deliberately adding some steps to the process of getting there, more back and forth, by putting more complexity in the process, you're going to get more of a look of complexity in your finished results.
Yeah, I think so. I think you really can. At least that's what I sort of aim for with this process. I think it becomes a little less, let's say, like predictable of how it was painted. That's kind of interest to me. I often find if I can just look at a painting and go, oh, that's this color right out of the tube applied directly. Nothing wrong with it, but I'm kind of like, that's not quite how nature appeals to my eye. There's just so much variety in even a single object. I'm looking at like a brick wall in front of me, and there's a single brick has so many little variations in it that I think for me, I kind of ask, how can I wrap my head around that level of complexity and achieve it without just trying to mix every little single pixel? Like what kind of effects, what kind of experiences is nature giving me? How's light playing off of things, and how can I in a way, sculpt my painting to mimic that biomimicry in a sense.
Yeah, well, and I think that that's one of the challenges that we run into painting is, you know, like I remember this experience I had. I haven't done a lot of plein air. You know, we were at this park, and it was I was just painting a rock face, and I'm looking at the rock face and all the lichen on it and everything else, and the light playing off of it, and there was a part of me that was just immediately sort of like defeated, like there's so much there, I will never capture it,
right?
And wanted to give up, right, and force myself to do the painting anyway. And of course I didn't get a photo of it, and if I'd wanted to get a photo of it, that's easy enough, right? We have the technology,
right?
But later on I'd like to paint quite a bit, you know, because I felt like I had managed to capture something about that moment. And that's the thing with painting, is it's part of a personal narrative on top of everything else. It's not just a simple graphic representation of something.
That's it. That's
Oh,
it.
basically, it's a graphic representation of something, but a painting has all kinds of feeling and emotion in it.
Yep.
Amen.
Well, you know, you can get feeling and emotion into a photo if you're, you know, the kind of photographer who really engages your medium on that level.
Yeah. Some really, really good photographers, you can almost like be in the room by looking at the photo, but usually you can get that sensation a little bit better with painting. That's what I've experienced. When I look at a painting, I feel more like I'm there with really good paintings than with really good photos for some reason.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, there's something that a photograph doesn't capture. You know?
Part of the thing about a photograph is it's so flat and like it's not three-dimensional the same way a good painting can be. And that's part of the reason why I like to paint. Is I'm a photographer too. I like to photograph birds. But anyway, part of the reason why I paint is because I just find that it's a way to make something look more like you're there than just like, oh, that's a nice photo of something. You can almost feel as if you're there if it's a painting.
Well, and not to mention the fact that you can go places that don't actually exist.
Yeah, you're right.
I often talk about James Gurney. Are you familiar with James Gurney, the Dinotopia guy?
Yeah, he's amazing.
His preparatory oil sketches and things like that. I love the fact that he posts all this stuff, you know, because when you see the book, it's just like, okay, this is just too good for a human being to do, right? But then you see all the steps, and you're like, this is how it's possible for a human being to do this. It just takes, you know, a crazy amount of work and, you know, skill. But you can see that there's a path there. There is a way to do it.
Yeah, his color layouts are just so brilliant. I did want to speak really quick to what you were saying about the rock face that you were talking about painting, and how indirect painting could really lean into that a bit. When we look at something with that level of complexity and think we need to paint it directly, unless you're using a palette knife with a lot of texture and kind of you know, getting that texture to happen by itself, it's very difficult to you know, stimulate that level of complexity in a painting with a brush. However, I think if we split apart those functions, one example would be like remove all the color information from that rock face and just go for the value, just go for the texture.
Let's see how this goes.
You could get a lot of complexity in there. And then, you know, through a little bit of glazing and maybe removing the glaze, stumbling, kind of like, which we'll get into next session, you can bring the complexity of that color information to play itself off of the complexity of the value information. And in a way, you know, I think it's just an inroads to things that would be, like you said, sort of daunting to just try to render. Because I feel the same way. I see a scene, I'm like all gung-ho to go paint a scene, and suddenly it's like way too complex to get in one shot. However, if I just took all the color information out, I might have a better chance at it.
I think that also there's this part of me anyway, and I think a lot of painters, you know, want to aim for this idea of being able to nail it with just the bare minimum amount of information, right? Where you get the sense of the place, you get the feel of the air, you can almost smell it, but you can still see the brushwork. You can still see the energy and the fire that went into that.
Yeah, that's amazing. When at the level of mastery for sure. In studying in the atelier tradition, like classical realism, they're saying everyone wants to paint loose. We all want to paint choppy and have that like just nailed it. Walked up, just slapped it on there and like brilliance. And the way they talked about it was like learn how to render it like precisely first. And we're talking about drawings at first, and then into paint. 3 years of drawing before you get into painting in that tradition. And they're basically saying, learn to do it really tight first. Learn to like really see all those values very specifically, like rendered down to the detail. And then, it's sort of an expression of your mastery of that. You can
interesting because there's a few famous painters that you could almost see them go through that arc, like Lucian Freud.
Sure.
His early pieces were very tight and very rendered.
Sargent would be a great one for that.
Yeah, and Michelle just pointed out, and boring. Yeah, Freud's early stuff was not that interesting, right? It was later on that it got more interesting. But this is worth mentioning also, because you look at his later paintings and it looks like they were just, slopped. Yeah. Okay, when I'm done with this, Michelle wants to say something. They look like they were just slopped on there, right?
Yeah.
That he just nailed every brush stroke in the first try. But I read an interview with somebody that sat for him, and it was an 8-month process.
Yeah.
But anyway, Michelle wanted to say something. What was that?
2 other examples would be Gerhard Richter and Chuck Close.
Oh, yeah, Gerhard Richter and Chuck Close. Another couple good examples of deconstructed and reconstructed. Yeah, I know. In Chuck Close's case, obviously he became a quadriplegic and had to adapt his technique and completely deconstruct what had started out as total photorealism into something that still has this incredible lifelike presence of the person, but is extremely abstractified.
Yeah, unbelievable, amazing work.
You ever get a chance to see like a major exhibition of his pieces?
Yeah, there's quite a collection in Seattle that's been there when I was living there. Yeah, amazing. Really.
Yeah, they brought a show of his to Chicago one time, and it had like the whole history. So you got to kind of go through everything chronologically, which is pretty amazing experience. And Michelle is also pointing out Gerhard Richter. That's another painter that really started out very, very realistic and tight, and then across his career he went totally abstract, but there was this interesting period of sort of abstract realism that happened in between there.
Picasso.
Yeah, well, Kaya's pointing out Picasso. Yeah, he's one of the best examples.
True.
Started very straightforward.
He's getting into some of life things.
It's very true. Yeah, we don't think of Picasso as a classical realist, but he certainly went to Academy, and absolutely, if you see his early drawings, like, wow, they're amazing.
They're amazing, but they're also not that interesting.
Really?
Right?
But that's the learning curve, It's like you kind of get your chops, and then you can do what you want. Basically, you have to, the old axiom was like, learn to paint like the masters, then you can do whatever you want. That was sort of more Dalinian quote. I think that's a very natural curve. I mean, you see it in old classical painters too. Titian, I mean, his earlier work was just like really tight, and then by the end of it, yeah, he was going blind too, but God, it got loose at the end. I mean, you see some of these old painters who we consider to be classical, and they were doing some seriously impressionist stuff by the end of their careers. They like kind of really gave some permission to explore that territory.
Yeah, and I don't know if that just came with getting to that point in their career where it's like, no F's given, I'm just gonna paint, and if people have expectations of me, I don't care. Or if it's just this, I imagine with some, it just became more and more difficult to do the really tight stuff.
Yeah, a little column A, a little column B. I think it's like a painter's prerogative, a painter's right by the end of your career to get loose. I mean, you just see this desire to no longer like you're saying, those early paintings, they might be tight, but they're not that interesting. And I think there's, after 50 or 60 years of communing with the art form, there's like a, maybe a
They're
bit
well
of
done,
a
but they're
romance.
not. They're well done, but they're not as interesting as other paintings.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that the thing that makes a painter's work interesting is not about how perfectly they can reproduce something. I mean, we have the technology to perfectly reproduce things, but is their interpretation of it interesting? And a lot of the time, it's going to have to do with the handling of the paint. And when the handling of the paint has some looseness and some spontaneous energy to it, it's just going to look a lot more interesting.
I would call it essence. I think it's bringing through something essential about our subject. It's not just what it looks like, it's what it feels like. And I think that there's something to that painters are, artists, we're feeling people. We're like very much, we feel what we're doing, and we're looking for the beauty. And we know that nature has us completely outmatched in its ability to render beauty. And we're trying to, I don't know, I see painters behaving more like nature behaves rather than behaving like a painter. And that, a little bit what, it's what I'd like to see happen in my career, certainly. And it's sort of why I'm interested in the philosophy behind these layers of paint and behind these concepts of what light and shadow are actually doing, as opposed to just mixing a color and placing it there, though that's impressive. And that's sort of, not the skill set I've really developed to mix it and place it exactly where it goes. It's more like, what is light doing? How is it bouncing off an object? The Impressionists were super excited about this. They were painting light. They weren't painting objects. And it was kind of like a new way of thinking about the spectrum. They also had a whole new range of color available to them. We'll talk about this in part 2, the different periods of pigment that we have available. And we're in a new period, a newish period now, where the colors we have available are, there's new ones all the time, basically, that never existed before. So it definitely opens up the parameters of what's possible with painting. There was a big revolution in the 1800s, mid 1800s, scientific revolution, artistic revolution, and industrial revolution. It all went hand in hand, for better or worse, but there were new, novel concepts that really came out of that allowed for Impressionism, that allowed for this brilliant new colors that had never been seen before, never been combined before.
Of course, some of this, is part and parcel with the larger march of history, where artists became, finally liberated from having to work for the church or having to work for some king, but instead having, more of a people's art. But, even so, like the Impressionists, they had to, take out their own gallery space just to break past the institutions that wanted to kind of keep art in one place that they could easily control.
Of course, right? Yeah, it's sort of the classic curve of things. There's a new movement, and it's rejected only to be, completely embraced, usually after those artists have passed away.
Right, exactly. When they can no longer benefit from it.
Yeah, suddenly Van Gogh is, the most popular artist, in history or whatever. And during his lifetime, he suffered so deeply for it. And, it's too predictable in a way at this point. But we're really fortunate at this time. I mean, I think if you went back a few hundred years, if you weren't born into high wealth and went to academy by age, 8 or 10, there was no way you were going to have a chance to be an artist. It wasn't available to you. And most of art history,
You wouldn't even have access to the materials.
Exactly. Or the opportunity. No one would have taught you. I mean, it was a elitist experience. And, that's this cultured kind of elitism. And what a gift now. We can be very self-made. You can go to YouTube University and learn a ton of stuff, or be just completely avant-garde and break through the glass ceiling. You've never experienced such creative liberation, at least not in sort of recorded time in the West. So we can, I'm kind of piecemealing because I jump around a lot. I'm trying to just balance values as I go. But you can see it starts to come together. I've got a few darker accents, but nothing is fully black. It's okay if I get a few really dark accents to just see how dark can dark be. Could I get it really dark in one place? That's fine. But I don't want to have like blackness consuming my underpainting. We'll get there. Even if you have a really dark composition, if we go too black too early in the underpainting, it won't be deep. It won't invite us in. It will be kind of like you can paint solid black and it still feels like it's right on the surface, as opposed to something you can dive into. That's just one of the parameters that I get kind of obsessed with, is depth in a painting. Not only the values match, but does the depth match? Could I create like a sculptural, can I reach into the painting and feel like it's pulling me in, versus how solid, some really thick highlight might be, and really playing with that illusion if you can.
Yeah, we spent a whole 8 weeks just doing exercises about depth tricks, because I'm sort of obsessed with depth, especially since I'm a non-binocular person, right? I have only one working eye, and so I just I infer depth in different ways from other people, and I think that sometimes it's almost advantageous because I have to think about it in ways that other people don't.
Yeah.
But it's also sort of this mystery to me, and made more vexing by the fact that I know that everyone else around me just has the experience. They just feel it without even trying, but yeah, we ended up, let's see, our depth tricks included just shape placement, how you overlap things. Because I think about, how do I pick things apart? Like when I'm driving, in order to not have an accident, despite the fact that I don't see depth, but anyway, contrast, raising and lowering your contrast as you get farther into the background or foreground, depending on whether it's a dark background or a misty one. Isolating your detail in certain areas, usually the foreground. We had volume shading, just simply trying to make your objects, look like they've got really clear volume. Cast shadows, which are one of the best, just, I don't want to say gimmicks, but if you use them wrong, they'll look gimmicky, but it makes for a great trick. And how saturated your colors are. Get less saturated as you get farther back. So yeah, there's a million ways that you can try to simulate depth, but then when you stack them up, use more than one of those tricks together, you start to really get somewhere.
Exactly. One that I like is subtle temperature shifts. I'm kind of harping on that temperature thing. And I think that's one of the ways that painters get like more information in a painting than what we might see when we just look at an object. Instead of just going, oh, it's, I'm moving from one value, it's slightly darker here and it's slightly lighter here. That darker value could be slightly warmer, and that lighter value could be slightly cooler. And it's sort of like we can double the amount of information within a value scale. Because if it's something, say you have 10 notes on the value scale and you have to go from 10 to 9 to 8, because they're all the same color, or they're all the same, temperature, we could put in like 10 to 9.5 to 9 to 8.5 to 8 by shifting from warm to cool and back again.
You're basically just sneaking a little bit of extra range into there.
You're like doubling your range by cooling or warming it. It's kind of like what you're saying about the clouds. Often you look at a cloud and you're kind of like, it's sort of just one, compared to the sky, the cloud is sort of just one color. But if you take the cloud in its own terms, there's so much more information in there that is not necessarily expressed through value. It might be very similar values in the cloud, but slightly different temperatures. And that is that's one of those other ways, like you said, you can just combine that with other tricks and
back it up.
You start to see it in paintings when an artist really is controlling their temperatures. It's really inspiring. And it's kind of predictable. It's like, oh, if you have a cool highlight, the next value down, you can warm it a little bit. The next value down, you cool it again. The next value down, you warm it, and you kind of just zigzag back and forth through your value scale until you hit your, sort of your darkest. If it's a cool light, then it's going to be a warm shadow, and vice versa. If it's a warm highlight, you're going to have cool shadows, and you can kind of just pinball it, like bounce back and forth all the way down.
We've got Amy Ward in the comments, and she's just wondering if we're going to be doing just a gray scale for this exercise.
This is basically, yeah, this is my chromatic black, my chromatic gray mixed from the 3 primaries. And ultimately it's, this is going to be just painted in grayscale as an underpainting. And then we'll readdress it in the part 2 class, glazing with color, deepening our shadows, and then building the volume and the highlights back again in full color. But yeah, this is just a grayscale exercise. I mean, it's to your liking. There can be color, and when I say gray, it doesn't just mean black and white. It doesn't have to. It can mean, you see all this whole range of colors that I've mixed. These are all ranges of neutrals that are achieved from the mixtures of the primaries. So I don't mean that it has to be completely dead, but it's just we want to not have it be full chroma. We're using these bright colors to achieve a number of neutrals, and that is sort of, we're saying like a bit like less and less and less, isn't more, or less is less, and maybe that's providing more options for us, but maybe those are better options and gets us in control of our color mixtures in a very sort of logical way. That vertebrae is looking amazing. Wow.
Thanks. Yeah, it's got a little bit more color range than yours.
Yeah.
And I'm also, it's a little bit more of an abstract shape, so I'm not being as precise with it. I'm just kind of slopping it in there, but I'm really having fun with these kind of muddy grays.
Yeah, there's a lot of feeling in them. There's a lot of like kind of emotion in them in a way. And like I said, yeah, it's really not about it being like totally dead. Like we can open it up into a color range. Like those shadows can get nice and cool. It really gives a lot of, it's still neutral. It's still very neutral. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's no one way, like we said, but it's just kind of like exploring how to use these colors in a way that is going to set us up for glazing in our overpainting, and set us up for, interesting effect of depth and of volume when we come back at an overpainting. So sort of just addressing the drawing stage in paint, the painted sketch in a way.
Yeah, so much of it really is about trying to set yourself up, trying to create an ideal situation next time you sit down to where it's like, yes, back to this. You don't want to sit down and have a big problem that you have to solve right off the bat.
That's it. It's making it really kind of bite-sized and logical, and you want to be excited when you sit down to paint, not like, oh God, what am I going to do?
Where did I leave off again?
So yeah, I mean, there's no one way to do it. You could take one value and kind of apply that to everywhere it seemed like it made sense for that to go in the painting. I tend to dance around it a little bit and just go where intuition guides me. I'll drop a shadow in here or there. Sometimes you can just fully render left to right, top to bottom. This is very personal. It's not a style to paint. It's just a technique, a way to use the colors, and a way to start, maybe to think in a different way and see if it brings you anything.
So here's a question for you, David.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances would you prefer to use this versus the technique, the wipeout technique that you showed us earlier?
Well, I think you nailed it earlier when you were talking about that painting of snow, and the snow being kind of like this cool white, this talking about white as the brightest blue. There needed to be a contrast under it, or maybe there was yellow, kind of a yellow sunlight glow, and I forget which way it was, but it was like putting something of its opposite. into into the beginning of the painting. So for instance, we're putting a lot of warms into this first brown sauce painting. So I'm probably going to be emphasizing a lot of cooler colors in the overpainting. I'm going to be mixing, there's not a lot of bright color in here. I'm probably going to be mixing some cooler shadows, like the silver pot is going to, or tea kettle is going to have like some interesting oxidized blues and steely grays and things. And those are going to contrast off of the brown underpainting. So I'm kind of like playing opposites against each other in a way. Whereas, if I'm doing this very cool steely gray underpainting, what I'm imagining is that warm colors, warm glazes are going to really glow off of here. Imagining that we're looking at that, the reclining nude, the Grand Odalisque, like it was kind of gray underpainting, and the flesh tones, like these warm flesh tones, sat really nicely on top of that gray underpainting. So I'm kind of just thinking that whatever I'm doing underneath, I might lean towards its opposite. Not exclusively, certainly, but I might lean towards its opposite. And really the only way to find out is, that's why we're doing these two different versions, is to see what happens. They're both going to dry, and we're going to have the chance to glaze on top of them and do overpainting, and we're going to just observe without having too many preconceived notions, because everyone's subject matter is so different that if we're all painting the same exact thing, lit the same exact way, probably predict a little more what's going to happen for each of us. But since everyone's kind of got their own inspiration, that's sort of the point of this, is to experiment and see what happens. Maybe you like one of these methods and completely don't like the other one, and I would feel like that's a success, to be able to discern what's working for you or not, what helps and what hurts. And some of this might seem a bit, one method might be completely tedious, and the other one you go, aha, that solved some issue for me, or helped me see something different. So it's all just kind of thrown out there.
It's going to be hard to know till we get a chance to put that second pass on it.
Completely.
I really enjoyed the wipeout method. I thought that it's a cool way to reveal a shape. I think that my main concern with something like that is I usually am ultimately aiming for a fairly built up look with my painting. And I'd be afraid that I'd feel inclined to be more conservative with my paint application, because it already has this nice luminosity for underpainting or something. So that might slow me down, although I like the look of it. So I am going to try it for something more significant at some point. Going over like this, I've done brown underpainting enough times with the idea of going more neutral at it, with it is nice, because you really can then flex in either direction, and I think that that's really useful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the underpainting is meant to be there as a guide, like kind of like we're saying with that green in the flesh, meant to be felt, not seen. And I think that we can lean into these underpaintings, that sort of transparency, that it's already kind of done. You're tempted to not clobber over it with solid color in those wipeout areas. But maybe more than anything, we can still paint over it, but it's giving us additional temperature information naturally through it. It's actually showing the effect of a glaze versus a scumble. And we'll get into this more next round, but we could see that the areas where we wiped out, those lights were really warm. And when we added titanium white, suddenly it looked really cold to the point of looking blue. And so even if we're going to completely paint over that, it is creating a map of temperatures naturally that we didn't contrive. Let's say it happened of its own accord. And I think there's something in, we're actually like grabbing the tail of nature a little bit by watching that happen. And I think there's a bit of the alchemical mystery inherent in that. when we're sort of watching what the materials naturally want to do. And then following suit, like, oh, wow, look, those are warmer shadows than the cooler highlights. I can play off of that, even if I'm going to completely mix colors to paint over it 100%. It still is a level of information in what we'll call the drawing phase, this underpainting phase, that influences the overpainting. To be slightly more sensitive, slightly more sophisticated, perhaps, slightly more subtle.
Amy's also wondering if we're thinning down that gray or if it's mostly the white that's kind of making it lighter.
It's just the white right now. I'm trying to use only use medium if I really need to. And because we're all using different paint, brands of paint and different qualities of paint and more or less oil and then more or less pigment, it's a little hard for me to know exactly how much oil is already in there. I would say like being as reserved as possible with oil right now. I mean, certainly we can I'll do a little spot. I'll add a bit more oil to the palette and find a place I can spread this a little thinner. It certainly goes further, faster with more oil in it, and that's no problem. It works quite well. The titanium white's so opaque that you can really probably get away with it quite a bit. There's so much paint on my brush. It's really, both techniques will work. I've been trying to just add the least amount that I need to at this point. I would keep the highlight more opaque, more solid, and keep the shadows. If we're going to add medium, I'd probably do it in the shadows more so. But in this particular layer of a painting, in this kind of style of underpainting, it's okay for it to be rather opaque, the whole thing to kind of be mixed with white, mix the value, and place it there. We're going to, in the overpainting, do more transparent glazes in the shadows. We're going to deal with that depth and that adding more medium in our overpainting layers. So yeah, I kind of try to keep the medium minimal at this stage. Sure, only if needed. And it depends on the surface you're working. I've got a bit of texture on this one. I'm kind of having to scrub the paint in to get it to fill in the little micro texture. Like Guy was saying with painting on some of those smoother panels, if you added medium, it's just sort of like you get slippery. It gets really slippery. So it will depend on your surface. And there's no one way to do it, but experience will kind of guide ultimately. And that's why this is such a great experiment. We can just see what works and what doesn't. Don't have to be super attached. Kind of, the learning experience, definitely. And see what happens. There's no way to predict what's going to happen with some of the glazes that are going on top of this until we've done this kind of thing over and over and over again. And even then, I think there's something in the mystery of what's this glaze going to do? How is it going to affect what's coming next? As tattoo artists, we really want to know how it's going to work out. It's really important to have it be predictable.
We still don't really, you know what I mean? It's just, we hope. But, we can have a favorite color combination, and we can have a client who, just for some reason, their skin tone just tweaks it in such a way that it doesn't quite work the way we want it to. And it might still be a good tattoo. They might even be pale. You know what I mean? It's just something about, their skin tone combines with that particular color scheme in a way that you hadn't seen in the past, and it just doesn't give you the same result. So you never know. You really, I've experience will tell you some, but there's some things that you're only going to find out when you actually sit down and do it.
Yeah. So this is sort of like blowing that out to the next level, kind of going, yeah, actually, I want to be surprised by what's happening in a sense. And it makes it interesting. I find that keeps it really intriguing, especially if we're sort of treating painting as something different than the medium that you guys are, you're engaging in day to day. Something a bit different, something to keep you mystified. I like that sense of wonder. What is going to happen when I do this?
Right. And of course, with tattoos, you don't want to have too much of that.
Yeah,
You want to have
a little bit, but you don't want to be too like vocally surprised in front of your client.
right.
Wow.
But it's helpful to be able to say, okay, you want bright blue, but you're fairly olive, and so that blue is going to look, more like a blue gray. And the olive is just naturally going to mute the brightness of the blue, and so it does. You don't want that to happen too randomly when you're tattooing, but when you're painting, you've got room for that. You've got room for all kinds of mishap.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's even kind of welcome, at least when you're experimenting, to go, oh, wow, I totally didn't see that coming, but now I can predict it. And now I might be able to work with that and wield it. Yeah, use it again next time.
So I'm starting to get to a point where I'm at a point with this where I feel like I would have to start adding actual color. So I think I'm going to call it a finished underpainting.
Yeah, it looks fantastic.
And let me bring it up here. Yep. So there's that. And you can see compared to the actual vertebra, I didn't include any of the warms.
Yeah.
I'm going to let that come in 2 weeks when we sit down again.
Absolutely.
And I'll be glazing and I'll be doing my fine detail. I usually try not to do too much detail in the early stages of a painting because it just takes the fun out of the later stages, because you're trying to work around your detail and not ruin it, rather than arriving at it in that last stage, which I just think is more enjoyable.
Exactly. Yeah, you become super tentative.
Yes.
Before you have to phone with David, why don't you talk about next weekend? Because he knows those guys.
Yes. Yes. Michelle wanted me to make sure that I mentioned next weekend's equinox party. And of course, you and Aloria have no doubt painted at these kinds of festivals where you've got, people like Android Jones and Aja doing live sets. And so, we're trying to bring about some of that same energy in an online event. And so we're hoping you guys can join us.
That'd be fantastic.
We're going to have a panel of, we're hoping to get around, 24 painters working. And during the first part of the set, when Aja and Android are doing their thing, we're just kind of going to be getting going and painting. But then when that set's over, then we're going to start passing questions around to the painters, and everything about the visionary process, or everything from philosophy to technique to personal experiences. So that's what's happening next weekend. We're hoping you and Aloria can make it because it should be a blast.
Awesome.
I think I might have to go soon, and I've got a slew of minor veterinary things and stuff like that. But I want you and whoever else is still on here to feel free to go as long or as late as you want. I just don't know if I can stick around for much longer. It's time to, the minor veterinary things and daughter has been really good. But it's time for me to make her oatmeal and read to her.
Yeah, I think we've gone longer than I even expected. I get long-winded. I did make some warnings about that earlier.
We like that though. That's, especially for the people painting along, that means time to get caught up and not feel like you're getting left behind in the dust. So
totally,
nobody minds that. And I don't want you to feel like there's any hurry now. There's probably a lot of people who are still, really benefiting a lot from hearing what you have to say. And I don't know if you guys want to open up the Zoom call to other painters at this point and start getting some feedback. If you wanted to do that, but otherwise, I would definitely let everyone know. Please post your underpaintings if you want feedback, and David and I will both try to get a look at them before 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And we'll especially check things out like on the day or two before David's next workshop and make sure that we haven't missed any posts that you've made. And also on, we always have Jason Leeser's drawing group on Sundays. So the morning before David's next workshop would also be a time to get final feedback before we get into our color sessions on these.
Cool. Very good. Yeah, I'll try to spend some time on the app in these next couple of weeks, just chiming in with people. Feel free to hit me up there and make a connection, message me or post, and I'll, tag me in it, and I'll come in and see what I can what I have to share for sure. If there's any questions, I'll hang out for a while and paint a little more and answer any questions. But otherwise, I'll be around virtually for the next many weeks, and look forward to continuing. I'll post my progress as well, and kind of see.
Okay, well, I am under pressure right now to go make that oatmeal, and daughter is living with two very unstructured parents, and she has been insisting on certain things happening at certain times, and I don't blame her. So I'm going to get on that. David, thank you so much. And again, feel free to keep going as long as you want. This has been a lot of fun, and it's just great to see you, man.
Likewise, it's been a while. Nice to see you too. And thanks so much. More to come.
I'll be talking to you in the next few weeks. Hopefully I'll see you next Saturday night for the equinox thing. And definitely in a couple of weeks for part 2 of this.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll see you Saturday.
Awesome. Wonderful. Yeah, we haven't had any more questions since that last one.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah. I think you've been pretty informative, so I think everybody's got a good place to go from.
Yeah, I usually try to overwhelm with information. Makes my life easier later.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and I certainly don't have all the answers, and I'm certainly not the best painter in the world, but I think about painting a lot, and I've thought about painting a lot, and I think if people are able to sort of listen back to the video again, it's maybe they'll gain something new out of it each time, or if they come back and want to see how something happened again, there's more there to explore, even if it's kind of a big download all at once, a dump truck in one shot. We covered a lot of ground. Each of these painting processes could open up and be a week of full days just to do one of these. And we've got some color mixing ideas, 2 different underpainting techniques, a whole presentation of historical stuff. I didn't even get into the alchemical pigments because we're already, we'll get there. We'll get there. There's a lot of material, but yeah, I think this format is great, and the video will be available for people to refer to if they want to.
Exactly. Yep. And then
I'll be available as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you'll be available. You're giving so much of your time. We really appreciate it.
Oh, well, it's such a gift to be back. I mean, I'm literally coming back. It was synchronous how it happened. Guy didn't know exactly either. He asked me to come teach, and it was like happened to be at the moment when I had the, when tattooing was like, you're doing this again. You're coming back into this full. I know I took a break for a lot of years, and I knew I would come back to it. I just I knew the world would have to be in a different time for it, a different kind of space. So that time is now for sure.
Yeah.
And it's all just really synchronous. So it's a wonderful way to be introduced back into the community.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Super grateful. So I'll hold this up again and people can kind of see, like, it slowly kind of takes shape.
Nice.
It gets there piece by piece, and really, the oil's wet. It just blends really nicely, and I don't need to add. I'm not particularly needing to add any extra medium to it to get it to blend.
That's nice.
And just very simple. It's like easy parameters. I don't have to deal with all the different potential color reflections happening. It's just getting the impression.
My mom's wondering if there's any chance you could hold each of the ones that you've done today up together.
Yeah.
Just like side by side.
Sure.
She's also in love with the beautiful painting of the woman having like her chakras opened or whatever is happening behind you.
That is colorgasm.
Colorgasm.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a gasm there. Wow.
Yeah. Let me pull these out here. I have to cover myself completely in oil paint, but
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
you can see, pretty much diametrically opposed in terms of
Yeah.
Wow.
temperature.
It's like a negative and positive almost.
Yeah.
I
Looks like gray, but now you put it next to this and it looks blue,
Yeah.
Yeah.
really blue.
Yeah, I like that.
Very
I like
cool.
this.
Yeah, it suddenly
Might
it
look
changes.
brown, but then you put it next to this and it looks like red suddenly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
There's
is.
a lot of optics that I think is the essence of what I'm, kind of hinting at, we're playing with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so wild how warm and cool they look when they're by themselves, it's not
Right.
necessarily as extreme.
Neutral.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, yeah.
Ding.
Yeah, it really changes. And so that's something, it's kind of a key that we're looking at before we do overpainting. It's like, oh, right, I don't necessarily need to put blue in a painting in order to make something cooler. It's more like how I'm dealing with neutrals. Also, this is being painted very opaque and solidly, and that is going to look cooler. And this is being painted very transparently, and that's going to look warmer. So that whole, Da Vinci's observation of smoke in front of the horizon is kind of what we're seeing now. This is, that's exactly what we're dealing with. So, yeah. I mean, we might have preferences. Like I like one more than the other sometimes, and I couldn't really tell you which because this one hasn't made it very far yet. But the brown one's looking very gratifying. It's
Yes.
kind of like, ooh,
yes,
it's much
and
further
more
along,
cozy.
and much quicker. It's like, wow, look how quickly, by treating the entire surface with one glaze, that imprimatura.
Yeah.
How much it's really unified. This is like very choppy right now, and it's like piecemeal together.
Right.
Eventually it will hang together, certainly. But for now, it's hard to see the whole thing because I'm so blinded by the white.
Yes.
Which is just, I don't know, it's intimidating, the white. I do not really, it's like, it's affecting how we're seeing the values of everything. There's so much white that it's hard to put an actual white highlight in on the teapot.
Yeah. Totally.
Whereas this, we knocked everything back a little bit, and it allowed the highlights to come in and be really more meaningful.
Yeah.
Selective in certain areas.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, so it's just kind of a dance in a way. It's the scenic route to painting, for sure. But it doesn't mean it has to take longer per se. And I think the quality of the journey can really be, very enjoyable. And it's sort of forming logic. It's like forming logic around painting. Like, okay, well, we had the white background. The only way to go from there was toward darker. The white is very cool, so the only way to go from there is warmer.
Yeah.
And it was like very opaque, so the only way to go from there is away from that is transparent. So we found a transparent, warm, darker color. So that's like a glaze. We're addressing values, temperatures, and transparencies all in one shot.
Yeah.
Once we got that all warm, darker, and transparent, the only way to go from there is kind of like back up toward, cool, light, and opaque again. So we're kind of just bouncing back and forth across those parameters.
It's a little
granted, it is. It's and granted, now we can go much darker and more transparent. In the, I haven't put in the deep shadows yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very excited for 2 weeks from now, getting to go back onto these things.
Absolutely. But I feel like the information is there, and it can be selective about where we put those dark shadows. I mean, there's certain areas where it might make sense to make that accent more intense.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the whole thing might not need to have that really dark shadows. I mean, it might be able to really point the focus. I might put my darkest shadow somewhere that contrasts my brightest highlight. And really decide where I want your eye to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably going to be.
I can already see it. It's so already there. Like you said, the information is already really quite there, and you're just going to be like,
it is
playing with it.
I think that's kind of the idea, is that you're, through very simple processes, helping yourself see what's coming next. Instead of like, I just don't know where to go with this. What should I do? It's, you can kind of see what needs to happen.
Yeah.
Even though this was not, this wasn't a work of extreme cerebral effort. This was kind of like, put a glaze, wipe it out. You kind of get the general gist, but there's all this information there that tells you, it kind of hints at what you want to do next. It suggests
Yes.
what comes next. And I think that is like being led by nature in that way, the nature of the paint, the nature of light. I find that to be a really exciting process of painting.
Totally. Being led by nature is pretty much always a good idea.
All the great artists throughout time have pretty much said the same thing. They're like, my master is nature. You hear it from everyone. It's like, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean go sit in the forest and paint? Like, it could. Or does it mean, like, nature is right here. There's light that's hitting my forehead, and there's another reflected light here. And everything.
Totally.
Everything we look at is nature. So we know light behaves consistently no matter what. We can rely on it. We can rely on the difference between light and a shadow. We'll never get them confused. So we can endlessly be observing anything in our field and studying nature if we're looking carefully.
Awesome. Well, I feel like I could listen to you talk about this forever, but I do actually have a dinner engagement that is coming up. So if you're feeling, hasn't been any more questions, and if you're feeling okay about meeting back in 2 weeks, is there anything else you wanted to mention to everybody before we head off?
I guess let's just stay plugged in on the app. I think it's a great time to break. We went longer than I even expected, and really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'll just follow up. We'll follow up on the app, and any questions that arise, I'll be available for. I think the main thing is just see how far you can get a grayscale painting, so you can get the whole thing covered in some amount of paint, and hopefully it will dry in 2 weeks. That's another reason I would maybe not use tons and tons of oil. Depending on your climate, it could take a while to dry. And then same with the Bistra, the brown one. Like, just see if it can develop with wiping out and with a little bit of titanium white highlights, and hopefully not too much oil in addition to what it takes to spread that brown layer. Just see how far the values can get developed, and so that we're ready in 2 weeks for not having to deal with any more sort of compositional or value concerns. And this is experimental, so I'd say try it again. See if this worked, or if it didn't work, or you need to experiment more. Just keep trying. This is totally a test, and you will not be graded on this. And, it's all just to learn and see what happens. So have fun. Go ahead.
Awesome. And yeah, we'll be seeing you on Saturday. Everybody else, if you hadn't seen this stuff at first or heard anything about it, on March 20th. At 8 p.m. we're having Aja Lu and Android Jones doing epic music and visuals, and there's going to be wonderful painters like David coming in and painting and answering questions. So we'd love to see you there.